she's really ready when she hits me, but that's coming next. Next item on our agenda is a presentation on the final recommendations of the mathematics, science, and social studies standards. As a reminder, during this presentation, staff and the committee chairs will provide an update on the work of the standards committees and their final recommended proposed revisions to their specific content areas. After the presentation, we will have an opportunity to ask questions of the committee chairs and then discuss among ourselves the proposed amendments that board members have submitted. The committee chairs will take our proposed amendments back to their committees for further review. Next month, the committees will provide us with their written feedback to our proposed amendments for us to consider when we vote on the mathematics and social studies standards in May. I'd also like to remind the board that we will have 5 minutes to ask questions after the committee chairs make their presentations. Additional time may be requested and approved if needed. Do I have any questions from my colleagues before I turn this over to Commissioner Anthes? The 5 minutes are just to make sure that everybody gets a shot at asking questions, and if necessary, we will modify and adapt the process. All right, Commissioner, please.
Great, thank you. I'm going to invite Dr. Kolsman and Dr. Cobb back up to kick us off. So, good afternoon, Madam Chair, Madam Vice Chair, members of the board. As the Chairwoman noted, today we are here to bring forward the final recommendations of the mathematics, social studies, and science standards. Just to make sure you're familiar with the materials that you have in your packet from Busy, you should have a copy of the PowerPoint. You should have a reminder of the review and revision process. You should have a schedule, and you should have copies of the final recommendations overviews for each of the committees, as well as copies of the amendments. So we will begin with just some overview materials, or overview information and reminders. So as a reminder, there's always 2 types of items with respect to the standards. This is an information item, which is different than this morning, which was an action item. So during the information items, what we'll be doing is bringing forward a presentation from the committees. They're going to respond to the feedback that you provided on the first round, or the initial draft of the standards. They're going to explain what changes have been made between the first draft and the final draft that you have in your binders. There'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions of the chairs, and then there's an opportunity for board members to discuss their proposed amendments for the respective content areas. The exception to kind of how this will all work will, in terms of action and information, is going to be science. So I'll direct your attention to the schedule. So science, because of the magnitude of the proposal, we're bringing forward for 2 information items in April, then again in May. So while we're presenting math, social studies, and science this month as information, next month the action will only be on math and social studies. We're going to give 1 more month of discussion and any feedback gathering that you would like for May before we have an action item in June. So what that means is if there are additional amendments that board members would like to propose specific to science, there's additional time for that. So kind of be aware of that piece, okay? The PowerPoint that you have just has a reminder of the number of comments that were received through our online standards feedback system for each of the content areas. And in your standards binders, there's a section that includes a printout of all of the feedback that was received on the initial draft of the revisions. So every single comment is there and printed for you so you can see those. And if there were any letters submitted outside of the online standards feedback system, they are included in that tab as well, so that you have access to all of that information. So I believe that we are now ready to start with our first content area.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
Suggest to me why world languages had such a high volume of comments?
That was a really interesting piece. If you go back to your binder from World Languages,
I didn't have it with me.
it was super thick, and there was an individual who really just wanted to make sure that their point was heard. So every single place where they could comment, they put the same comment. So
Well, I noticed that. Actually, I noticed that in some of the other comments, ones
Right.
that I went over this time, but I
right.
didn't catch that.
Yeah, so it was really repetitive. It was all about aligning the Colorado's World Languages standards with the ACTFL standards.
Gosh,
which
I
is,
hope you did that after all that input.
yes, we did.
Thank you.
So.
I just thought that was, I was just a little
Mhm.
struck by that, but I didn't have the books with me to look it up. Thank you.
Right, you're welcome. So, like we did last time, what we'll do is Floyd and I will change seats. Now we can't talk about this being a choreographed move because the dance standard. Well, I guess we could because you did just
We adopted
adopt
dance.
the revisions for a dance. So we'll go ahead and invite our chairpersons and CDE staff for our Social Studies Committee, and we'll be handing it off to Dr. Cobb and the committee.
And we need to find our binders. Where's my leg? Where's my leg?
Thanks, Carol. Good.
Okay, I think we're ready, so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Cobb.
All right, good afternoon, Madam Chair, Madam Vice Chair, members of the board. It is my pleasure to introduce our Social Studies Committee. To my right is Chris Elnicki. He is an instructional facilitator with a specialization in social studies for Cherry Creek Schools. To his right is Dr. Andy Robe, teacher on special assignment in science and social studies for the Brighton School District. And to his right is Dr. Stephanie Hartman, who is our social studies content specialist here at CDE. The format of this presentation will go as we did the last month. The committee members will review notable changes and then have an opportunity to give the responses to the questions that you all offered. In addition to that, they'll go over some of the themes of the public feedback, and then we'll be able to move into questions and amendments that we may have. And so at this point, we'll transition over to our Social Studies Committee and allow for them to start with the presentation.
Good morning, or good afternoon. We've made the transition. Before Andy provides responses to the state board questions, I'd like to share a little bit about the Social Studies Committee. We had 28 outstanding educators representing all regions of Colorado at all levels of education, preschool, K-12, and college. We were lucky to have such a dedicated, diverse, and fascinating group to work with. When they entered this process a year ago, I don't think any of our volunteer committee members realized how much time they would be dedicating to this effort. All members worked diligently, collaboratively, to make revisions to the standards document aimed towards best outcomes for students. Members were organized by social studies disciplines and grade bands. Many of our whole group discussions focused on two areas: creating tighter K-12 alignment and clarifying connections between the four disciplines within a grade level. The subcommittees tended to reach agreement throughout the process. At times there were disagreements and debate. In these cases, issues were brought to the whole group. Alternatives were generated and discussed. Time was provided to more deeply explore the issue, and the whole group would continue to deliberate until consensus was reached. These recommendations represent the consensus of the committee members and are the result of lengthy and productive discussions. Please refer to the final recommendations overview document, which I think is page 1. That That first page and a half is a recap of what we discussed at the state board meeting in, when were we here, in February or January? In that month that we were here last time. This information is being provided as a refresher. I won't read through these at this time, but I'll summarize briefly. Concerning economics and personal financial literacy, the 2009 standards outline personal financial literacy targets in both math and social studies. Outcomes once housed in math have been moved into social studies where appropriate. Additionally, some personal financial literacy content has been shifted to different grades. For high school economics, changes were made structurally to create focus on decision-making, microeconomics, macroeconomics, and global economics. Changes in 6th and 7th grade standards were made to balance the 4 disciplines of history, geography, economics, and civics. The 6th and 7th grade evidence outcomes now focus on both an historical and a regional lens to provide districts and teachers more flexibility when teaching about the Western and Eastern Hemisphere. A parallel structure is now evident between the approach at 6th grade and 7th grade. Finally, with high school civics, changes included an increased focus on civic virtue and democratic principles. Gaps in the content, especially around the political process, were filled with greater detail. Now my co-chair, Andy, will share the responses to the state board's questions and comments provided from our last gathering.
Thanks, Chris. Good afternoon, Madam Chair. I'm going to start on page 2 of this overview with the state board questions and comments. I'll work it as the feedback question or statement, and then I'll read out the response. The first one is, it is important to have social studies texts that match reading level for the grade. Committee response. The committee agreed. The adoption of social studies text is conducted at the local level. The Social Studies Committee feels that educational leaders and teachers will find ample resources available to support the teaching and learning expected within the revised standards. The second state board feedback or question. There seems to be a number of undefined terms across the social studies standards, i.e. discern, evaluate, describe, explain, discuss. The foundation is a knowledge requirement. If you don't know something to begin with, all of the above are meaningless. The response from the committee is that the standards include both skills and content. These skills should not be approached as standalone concepts, but should be integrated with appropriate content, just as it is impossible to teach thinking skills to students without the content to think about. It is equally impossible for students to understand the content of a discipline without grappling with complex questions and the investigation of topics. The revised standards define clear parameters for what skills and content are expected, with appropriate flexibility around content categories. Thus, districts are afforded some choice around content as they determine what is best for their students and community. The final feedback suggested State Board suggested including student loans as an important aspect of personal financial literacy. The committee added student loans to the high school economic standards for personal financial literacy, specifically in GLE 7 EOB. Next, so that concludes the part of the responses to the committee's questions. Thank you. And the next part, I'm going to share the notable changes made to the standards based on public comment. Public feedback or request. First one. Better alignment is needed across K-8 for integrating the social studies within each grade level. The committee agreed. A better transition between grade levels was needed. This integration was done to better balance the social studies disciplines at the K-8 grade levels. Second, high school economic standards should include macroeconomics. The committee agreed and applied the economic terms of decision-making, microeconomics, macroeconomics, and global economics, and specifically Econ GLE 3 addresses macroeconomics. Number 3, provide content-specific examples where appropriate. The committee agreed, and specific content examples were added throughout the K-12 Social Studies Standards document. And finally, add additional literacy statements. The committee agreed. Additions and examples were made to explicitly connect key literacy concepts to social studies standards in all grades. That concludes that section.
So at this time is an opportunity for board members to ask questions of our committee, and I believe that as Board Chair Schroeder noted, there's a 5-minute time limit for that piece.
Board Member McClellan.
This is more of a comment and a thank you for lending your professional expertise and your time, and that extends to all of the committee members for all of the sections that we'll be looking at today. But I just wanted to give a special shout out of thanks for including the subject of student loans. It's one topic on which I did receive input directly from constituents, because as soon as high school ends, kids are signing loan documents in many cases, and so I think it has particular relevance, and I really praise the committee for embracing that, that update. Thank you.
Thank you.
Board Member Flores.
You know, I probably missed this at the first, but I just, oh, excuse me. But I noticed that animals, plant life, aquatic life, and such was not added to the standards. And I know they're so important in the early grades. And there's so many facts about these creatures and life forms that kids are so interested in, and especially in geography, and that go along with humans. I mean, we wear coats. They wear coats too, meaning animals. And I just wondered if that was too much going into the curricula, or was that just something that teachers would just do? But I think, you know, the specificity of those entities are so important. Don't want you to go back to the drawing board or anything, but it was just glaring this time that I just didn't see them. And I don't know if the first time that I went through it,
Member Flores, thank you so much for your feedback. We believe very strongly in the importance of making connections between disciplines. And so one of the really great connections I think you just pointed out between science and social studies is that social studies is about looking at geographic locations and regions and habitats and things like that. And then the science brings in those really key aspects of animals and plant life and aquatic life and such.
Thank you for pointing that out.
Of course.
Thanks.
Board Member Sheff.
Would you clarify the 5-minute intro? What was that?
I'll let you
Are we on the
know.
clock, 5 minutes?
Yeah, I'll let you know if you
Summatively or per person?
just go forth.
Anyway, thanks for the hard work you put in on these standards. Here's my question. The Common Core standards were passed in 2010, and we know that 15% of those standards in math and ELA are determined by the state. Social studies is a separate thing, but they're heavily influenced by the ELA standards. And we, looked at some of those documents, the performance indicators and identity themes and all of that. There have been a number of critiques of the standards, the history standards as they link to the ELA Common Core standards. Question, you had about 80 people who gave comments on these standards, and did they do a deep dive on the content? Because I guess when I look at the recommendations both from the board and from the public, they seem really like tweaks, instead of a deep dive as the blueprint of the standards, how they're linked to the ELA standards, the readings that are suggested and recommended, the identity themes that course across the standards. And I just wondered if there was discussion like that, or was it a lot of tweaking but not really a deep dive into the content of the standards in the case of social studies?
So, Dr. Scheffel, thank you for that. What I think would be helpful is if the committee can address the degree to which the committee looked at the Common Core state standards for ELA in either the development of the social studies standards or in the revision process.
I mean, I would begin with when the standards that we were revising when I was part of that work in 2008, 2009, Common Core was not in the room. I mean, we knew that there were literacy standards being developed, but it was not part of the process. So as we came back to revise that, the only place that it really showed up is after we had done the revisions to that current model. Did we go back and do alignment with our current Colorado standards and then list those in that more of that suggested aspect for the literacy connections, but in no way did that find itself into the evidence outcomes and the grade level expectations.
Was there a deep discussion about the content? I know there's a lot of process words in the standards. I think that characterizes all the standards that we've been reviewing. When we look at content, we think of history, for example, which is just one of the 4 represented in social studies. We think of timelines and people and events. Of course, connections matter a lot too, and process, but really, I think great history instruction is about students understanding the past, methods of methodologies that help us access what went on in the past, and looking at timelines and people and events. And as I look at the language in the standards, I don't see a lot of language around that content. Was there discussion about that, or did people feel like they wanted the maximum latitude and allow the textbooks and the other content to dominate? Or?
Yeah, I think there was plenty of discussion. I think part of the issue is the model the framework that we're working in. It wasn't, our charge wasn't to rewrite, it was to revise or to, start a new document. But as far as the feedback we did receive, as far as increasing some of those content examples, I think we can show places where that's happened. We could go to high school history if you wanted to right now as one example of that. I can point to a page. Now, where did I put my magic stick?
Let him finish. Let him finish.
Was it there? I had to move it. There it is. 101 and 102 in the standards document. In high school standard 1 history, the grade level expectation is about continuity and change, cause and effects, complexity, unity and diversity, significant ideas in U.S. history. All of those examples in C, which include things like civil rights, migration, immigration, mass media, landmark Supreme Court cases, war on terror, those are not in the current standards. Aspects around economic cycles were not there, I don't think, prior. The systemic impact of racism, nativism, role of patriotism, expansion of rights, and the role of religion was not there before. Industrial age, space age, digital age, Ford assembly line, NASA, personal computing was not there before. Political parties, suffrage, reform, activist groups, social movements, suffrage, human, civil rights, and role of government. All of those are new additions based on our response to the board. And it's one example, and there's about, I think
it kind of
12
makes
pages.
my point. I mean, I was looking at a book before I came called Timetables of History, and it's just awesome timelines about people and events and connections. And though you can list that language, it doesn't really teach history per se. It's topics. And the language that you referenced before that, compare, contrast, and all that, those are processes. So that's all good. And language that links to inquiry. The question is, are students really understanding history by that meaning events and people and timelines and connections? And I think some of that language can get there, but I think that overall I looked at all the language in the standards and counted process words versus content words, and it's heavily weighted toward process language. And so I think one could make the argument that, well, the standards are guardrails, and teachers can take those guardrails and they can exceed them, and they can choose curricula and content that enhances and specifies and gives great detail around that language. The only thing I would say is that the textbook companies, though, align with the language in the standards, and the tests align with the language in the standards. So to the extent that teachers don't bring in original sources and really exceed the standards, students can get a pretty weak sense of history based on these standards alone. So I don't know if others, I don't know what kind of conversations you had in the committees. I'm sure it would have been great conversations, but I really think content is so essential for students. And when we look at the nature of student understanding of history, according to a number of reports, it just seems like students are really struggling in this area. So I appreciate all the work you did.
I think those are very, very important points.
Yeah.
I mean, good teaching isn't going to be about the textbook. Good teaching is going to be about a lot of resources and really opening up for, making something accessible for all the students in the room. And that's kind of hard to put in the standards.
Do you have an amendment that you would make that would solve your concern?
Not at this time. I'd have to sit with CDE and literally write. And I don't know if there's time for that, but.
Okay, thank you. Board Member Flores?
Well, I was just thinking that when I brought up that topic before, I don't think you were here when we went into it. I was criticized by a couple of members by telling me that was content and that was curricula. And so, we were not dealing with curricula. We were dealing with standards. And so that's how it was. Because I too had, issues. In fact, I went straight into it with why aren't there animals and such in this? And you corrected me and said, well, they're in science. So.
And may I respond? Sure. My concern would be is the textbook companies look at these standards and they align in many cases with the language in the standards. And so if that's the case, along with the assessments, then because process dominates in the standards, process tends to dominate in the textbooks. Now, teachers can exceed that. They can bring in other resources, and I hope they do. Good teachers will. But I do think that there's an inordinate focus on processing the standards globally, and I think that unless teachers really know how to exceed and extend, I think students then lack the content they need to think about history. The process is great, but if they don't have strong content, then I think there's a weakness there.
So this goes back in my memory back to the 80s when we did our first set of Colorado standards, and there was a threatened lawsuit that because there's a prohibition in Colorado to designate curriculum, that even setting standards created that was actually curriculum. And so I think we've struggled all these years to be thoughtful about that. And I would agree, I don't see a clear line either. I would guess that if somebody, but I'm confident that when somebody looks at these revised standards in just about every subject area, there are places where we get curricula-ish. And I think we try not to. But I think it's a real concern that's been around for a long time. The lawsuit never materialized, in part because of the perceived vagueness that is in our standards. Board Member Flores.
Well, I just have another comment, and my comment to yours is, are we a state that is that large that will sell that many textbooks? I was in another state where everybody descended when we were talking about standards, and that was Texas. And every textbook company was there, but then, the department worked line per line per line per line, and it was kind of a circus. So I don't know if we want that or if, Colorado will merit that scrutiny by the book companies. Not that it's not wonderful, it's great, but I think they go to big states where they are going to sell large numbers of textbooks and such. And I don't know if Colorado is one of those states. Maybe California and Texas, possibly. But I'm glad we have our own standards. And thank you for the work you do.
Board Member Goff.
Thank you. Yes, I add to the gratitude for the work. Appreciate it. My second most favorite subject area in school, if I hadn't have taught what I taught, it would have been along with Hugo. First of all, I enjoyed, on a different kind of level this time, reading the discipline media literacy connections. I think that is probably the one area of comment that I personally had most on from folks. And it was interesting because it was tied to social studies, not so much to just reading in general or a comprehension from the literacy standpoint. So thank you for the work on that. As far as the textbook discussion, worth keeping in mind that the word textbook these days is, I'm not going to say it's old, because that's not fair, but the type of sources, the type of resources, the type of information is so much more varied, even since we wrote our 2009 standards, that I think we'd all be well served to keep an open mind about what that means. So when you're talking about resources in general,
Systems.
and the which ties back in around, circle back again to a little bit of the media literacy angle. So I just want to say thank you. I have no comment to make about the content. I think it's been well embellished and built up and fortified, and as far as we can go. And appreciate your work very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Board Member Rankin?
I have one question that I'd like to direct. On page 49, don't even look at it because I can tell you what it says. It says, ask questions to develop further understanding about the geography and development of Colorado. And it says professional skills, self-advocacy. Can you tell me what that means? Now you may look it up. It's number 2 on the right-hand side.
Here, right here. That, I can answer that.
Yeah.
That comes from the Colorado Essential Skills, and when we were going through the process, we were trying to fit best in the skills to the particular GLE and EOs that would match well. And so we thought that this one, about asking questions, would go along with the notion of research and using geographic tools, and so that's why it's present there.
What is the professional skills self-advocacy?
It's actually a category in the Colorado Essential Skills, like entrepreneurship or professional development.
So if you look right above it, says professional, on number 1, it was professional skills and information literacy. Every one of those Colorado Essential Skills is tagged to show its origin from the original document. And then we
Where's the original document? Is there an original document in each one of these? Or is this something that we have tattooed on our arms?
No, we don't have any unknown tattoos. Thank you for that question. So if you remember back when the standards, the 2009 version came out, all of the skills that are in CAP for K around, there's about 17 here, like civic engagement, productivity, flexibility. We call those the 21st century skills. Right. We decided to not call them the 21st century skills anymore because we're well into the 21st century. And so we've termed them the essential skills. So it's the, it's the rebranding of 21st century skills. And we've also bucketed them, which is a really technical term, for kind of categorize. You don't like buckets. We categorize them into categories that fits what our post-secondary workforce readiness description is, and those are like personal skills, professional skills, entrepreneurial skills, and maybe interpersonal skills. So all of those CAP for K required skills are in that. We can point you to the place on the website where that lives. It's not put into the notebook. Right, it's not in the notebook. It's part of CAP for K and underlies kind of the language that's here.
Thank you. Proceed, yes.
And I'd like to go back to the state board feedback questions on the undefined terms, discern, evaluate, describe, explain, discuss. I would like to reinforce that just the basic core knowledge of facts is not addressed in the way that I think some people feel it should, and I'm top on the list on that. Just basic knowledge rather than those words that I just read. I still believe that is lacking. social studies that we have is a 125-page document. Global is used 84 times in this document. Global society is used 12 times. United States history is used 12 times. United States government is used 11 times. I really feel we should be stressing more about the United States and the state of Colorado, and I know I'm standing on a soapbox right now, and that's just fine. Colorado history, used 5 times. Colorado government, 1 time, page 57. This kind of got me interested into looking at other words that are used. Congress was used 8 times, 7 of them to describe our position on this state board. Congressional District 3, Congressional District 2. The word Congress is used 7 times. So it is used 1 time on page 113, and let me quote it. Describe how fiscal policy, tax and government spending, which is controlled by Congress and the President, can be used to stabilize the economy. I just find that an interesting fact, along with all those others. So with this, I feel, I know you've done a lot of work. Mr. Annicki, I have to say, I know how much time it takes to do something that you never know what you're getting yourself into. But I still have some direct difficulty with some of the things in this document. I think they're missing. I think it leaves a lot to interpretation, and sometimes that word is used to allow students to come to a conclusion that may be different than what really happened. So I just wanted to get those points out.
Are you ready to make your amendment?
Is it time to do amendments too?
Sure. That's what we're doing.
Okay. I'll move on to my amendment.
Because that'll change some of your words, word counting.
If we put it in, it will.
Madam Chair, I apologize.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The amendments, or approving of the amendments would be taken at the next board meeting.
Oh, I know that, but
Oh,
to
you-
discuss them.
Oh,
To
I
present
apologize.
them
Okay.
for us to, am I wrong?
So actually, I guess what I wanted to know is, because we were, the questioning portion of the agenda, I'm just wondering, are we now moving into the amendment portion? Because when we get into.
I didn't know we were,
You were looking at the people rather than the points.
Yeah.
Yeah, see if anybody else.
The reason
Does
why
any-
we,
go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, we wanted to separate out the question part from the amendment piece because we're asking that our chairs don't respond to amendments this month. So we wanted to kind of allow that opportunity for kind of a closing of the questioning piece and then an allow of the board to
Okay.
talk about
But
their
can they
proposed
stay here
amendments.
in case we
They
wander
will
off
s-
somewhere else?
They will stay here, absolutely.
Is that okay? Unless, are there some more comments? Sure. Board Member Chappell.
So, and again, I've only been on the board 1 month here in the second iteration, so I'm trying to figure out where we are in the process. But I did take the time to go through the documents with page numbers and such, and I don't know what the amendments should look like, but I mean, I quoted pages where there were no mention of historical events or people, page 12, page 21, page 38, page, it just seems to lack people and events, which seems to be the core of history, and I know that's only one of 4 areas addressed in social studies. But, I mean, would those be considered amendments, or are you saying that to make an amendment, I mean, I'm not sure what where this feedback goes. Do you then take this back to your committee and say, would anyone be up for adding historical events and people on page 21? And then you bring it back, or am I supposed to sit with CDE and say, well, these would be some seminal events that would be part of this range of time that would be relevant, or what, how does that work?
I think we structured it so that there would be amendments that we would vote on. And so you'd have to be kind of
Are
specific.
these specific enough then, or you have to list
Yeah, I don't,
specifics?
so all due respect, I don't really know what you're saying in those, so I would need something to
I guess
clarify
I
that.
was sort of pointing out the same thing that Member Rankin did, which is a lot of process language, which discuss common and unique characteristics of cultures. Okay, but which cultures and what relevance did they have? And cultures rise and fall in various ways over time.
And you
for
want to
different
identify the culture.
Economic reasons.
You
Yeah.
want to identify culture, and I think that's what I heard is not the intent, that in fact there were to be options for teachers to identify which ones they want to discuss. And I think that's the whole idea behind standards as opposed to curriculum, but you all can correct me if I'm wrong.
That's correct.
Board Member Durham?
Well, lot about this format. There's a lot about this format that I don't like, and I guess maybe it's expressed by the comment that, because what you end up with is prepared graduates. So if I read what a prepared graduate at the high school level should do, and I read through the things they should know something about, which are enumerated, at least, unless I've not read properly, and I've always possible I could miss something, but I would say there are two things that pop out that have not been important enough to list as a prepared graduate knows something about, which is the Civil War and the American Revolution. Did I not read everything, or are they simply not in the high school standards of what a prepared graduate should know? And if you could tell me what page, I'll...
It's probably history.
I'm looking at history.
But you're right.
Member Durham, just one moment, I'll find the page number for you.
So they're there someplace, I missed them.
So the one aspect of the way that the original document was created in 2008, one of the pieces of feedback I understand that was heard from the field is that all of U.S. history, trying to teach all of U.S. history at the high school level was nearly impossible to do. And what teachers ended up doing was...
Well, I know I'm a little old, but I managed to do that in 1969 to 8th graders. We managed to get through the whole U.S. history thing, so why is it so hard now?
It's been another 50 years.
I understand there's been 50 years, but you'd think you'd manage to work your way through it.
I understand your concerns.
Well, what page is the Civil War and the American Revolution on? See why I missed it.
Page 90.
Page 90. That's the 8th grade standard.
Yes, sir.
So you teach the American Civil War and the American Revolution in the 8th grade, and
Yes,
it's
sir.
not taught again, huh?
Correct.
Let me start with a different line of questioning if I can. Tell me in 4 years of high school, as a general rule, or to the best of your knowledge on the average, what are the required social science courses? Or are there any required social science courses in the 4 years of high school? As a general rule, or speak to your own district, or...
Civics.
Speak to your own district, yeah.
Currently in Brighton School District 27J, we follow the state and have civics as a required course, and we've added economics as a required course, and then we also have U.S. history and world history.
And
required?
based on feedback that we...
So you have 4 required social science elements in high school?
Yes, sir.
So in U.S. history is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
But you wouldn't revisit in U.S. history what's the most seminal event in United States history, which is the Civil War, which I think if you understand the causes and effects of that, you have a pretty good understanding of a lot of what goes on today.
I thank you for the comment. I agree. In fact, in the Brighton School District, we have followed the state standards pretty closely in that 8th grade starts in, as you probably know, the beginnings, the causes of the American Revolution, and travels through the beginning of Reconstruction and actually bit through it. So then in high school, they take it over and from that point. Interestingly, though, during my time there, we've changed U.S. history from 11th grade to 9th grade to create a continuity between those two courses. So it becomes almost a 4-semester U.S. history.
And I would add, when those decisions were made in 2009, the feedback, the concern was there were so many high school courses that were not getting into the Eisenhower administration as far as a timeline and not getting past that. And it was very important for the people doing the work to make sure that there was enough time to get into at least to move through the Reagan years and the block coming and the fall of communism and a lot of those essential. I mean, those were the kind of conversations we were having then. Now it would be much more than that, but really having that opportunity to have modern history. Now, can you learn that without revisiting? I mean, can you learn civil rights without revisiting the Civil War? You really can't, and Reconstruction and that era after. So I think those are common practices. It's just not in the standards. But if we had, there was some surveying we did that was part of a national survey about 5 years ago, and which kind of backs up what Andy said. U.S. history and a government course were the most common in Colorado. In most cases, students were having 3 or 4 years of social studies, but the requirements at individual buildings, at individual districts are different. And in many high schools within a district, they will have different requirements. There may be an econ requirement at one building and not at another, or a geography requirement at one or the other, depending on what they've, that's just part of the reality. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, it's just where it's at.
And looking at Dr. Scheffel's comments about a good part of history being understanding timelines, and does anyone anymore, do they ever, when testing these subjects, give you 10 events from, say, the French and Indian War to the Stamp Act to the Tea Party to, I'm talking about the Boston Tea Party. Since we now have 2 Tea Parties. But, so, and have them order those events in the order in which they took place.
Yes, and you can find that in examples on the CMAS.
Is the perception, in your judgment, is the perception that high school graduates generally across the country, or in Colorado specifically, are as weak as, at least certainly I perceive them to be in these, in government history and economics? Is that, in your judgment, inaccurate? That, because you see examples of it all the time, and I have a good joke that I could tell that would actually illustrate it, but it's actually not a joke, it's an unfortunate true story. But in your judgment, is the public portrayal of the lack of knowledge of events, historical figures, the documents, the founding documents, the governing documents, as weak as it appears to be?
In my judgment, it is where our students are performing in our state is much higher than some of the assessments we're looking at suggest. And in many cases, those assessments, students have no skin in the game, whether it's a NAEP assessment or whether it's a CMAS assessment. I think there's other measures we could look at, but in the conversations, and I think in the opportunities when students are able to perform in situations like We the People events, when they're in mock congressional hearings, I think the depth of knowledge and the kind of thinking and their application of facts and thinking on their feet is extremely high, and as high as it's ever been in the United States. Maybe a greater question is, have we ever been very good at that as a country? Yeah. And maybe we have continued to have a weakness there that certainly we should push on. But I don't think it's necessarily this generation. It's probably more of a systemic issue that's been part of the United States for a while.
Well, I think I would disagree with that. I mean, I've told my colleagues a number of times about the geography course, which was required when I was in high school, and you got a blank map of the world. I had the boundaries of the countries written in, and you had to name every country and its capital and spell them all correctly, and there are only 2 grades, pass and fail. Does anybody ever do that anymore? I mean, the value of rote memorization, I mean, we've all seen it on television. You go out and ask a group of high school age kids, can you name the 3 branches of government, and the odds are they can't do it. At least that would be the perception that's created by the media. Is that perception inaccurate?
I believe that my colleagues and myself oftentimes use rote memorization. One time comes to mind is having the kids in 8th grade be able to recite the preamble, because it's such an important establishment of what government is about. I find that rote memorization too opportunities to have games with kids, remembering the presidents, remembering the amendments and what they're about. There is currently a very important movement in education about, kids can jump on the internet and find that information. The notion of why are we having the kids come to school? There's so much information accessible, and so we have this, I think, even greater, more severe role in what we do as educators, because we have to help the kids to understand that information and then to get them to, the notion of understanding is really important, and that's certainly an important move in taking the content and skills that are presented in the state standards and moving them toward understanding, so they have something to hold on to. We know that when we're not careful, just providing information, not linking it to an understanding, why are we doing this, then it tends to go away. And so we're trying to build an accumulation of information in the kids and understanding, and they have to be together. They have to walk hand in hand. It's most definitely. The second point is that I just feel that we have created such an emphasis on math and reading skills and writing skills in the elementary levels that oftentimes social study is put on the back burner.
I agree.
And it's something that we're trying to battle with and work on, and it's something that we see kids coming in to sixth grade where we're really going to start to get after it, and they don't have some of that background, regrettably. And it's just because of the emphasis has been on reading and writing and math.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I'll conclude here in just a second, but I think a good part of the rub is, for me, is that we've been talking about higher standards in one form or another since 2001. And by virtually any measure, performance has not improved, even though standards are allegedly higher. And I would view these standards for high school graduates, I mean, frankly, for my 8th grade history test, if this is the kind of stuff that they knew and that's all they knew, they wouldn't have been able to get through my 8th grade class. And the quick story I'll tell is a true story. A state senator was carrying a bill to implement the Colorado constitutional amendment on medical marijuana. And he was being lobbied outside the Senate chambers by someone who was very forcefully saying, the United States Constitution gives me the right to sell medical marijuana, and to which the senator said, don't you mean the Colorado Constitution? To which the individual, after a brief pause, responded, dude, you mean there are 2 of them?
Board Member Schaffel.
Yeah, I guess maybe part of this discussion and some bigger discussion is the role of the standards themselves, right? And so when you read language, like analyze historical time periods and patterns of continuity and change through multiple perspectives within and among cultures, which is standard 1 history 6th grade. Teachers are required to put those up and align what they're doing to standards. I mean, a lot of the performance evaluation systems in the districts, people do walkthroughs. They want to see what standard are you teaching to today. So you put that up, and you can see where you could teach almost anything with that language. Now, teachers are subject matter experts, and they're blowing that out in the context of where they are chronologically in curricula and so forth. But I think it just strikes me that as we look through this language, it doesn't give a lot of guidance on content. It's just lots of process. So I think to some degree we love our teachers.
That's the rub that we have.
Yeah, and so do the standards help then? Because we spend a lot of time writing them and enforcing them in terms of teachers using them and publishers align with them, testing companies do. So I just think that's a huge issue. I think the language, while it can be helpful, is just very vague.
Board Member McClellan.
Speaking of guiding documents and constitutions, I just want to give yet another shout out to Dr. Colesman for very early on in the process acquainting me with, and I hope I don't bungle the section and the article, I think it was Article 9, Section 16 of the Colorado Constitution that indicates neither the State Board of Education nor the state legislature shall prescribe textbooks in the state of Colorado. I hope I got that citation correct. That was very helpful, and I want to thank the committee for their work in balancing the requirements of coming across with meaningful standards without being too prescriptive. I think that probably must have gotten tricky from time to time, and I appreciate your attention to this task. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else before we get to amendments? Board Member Flores.
Well, I can see what you're saying about timelines and how it's not specific, but I think it took me some time to kind of understand that, you know, much can be added by a teacher and a school, a district, because districts do have their own curricula and such. And so I think this is broad enough so that it can be included. I mean, I'm thinking out of my Western Frontier class that I took. I mean, it was a special class, and this guy had just studied from his big rural. My high school teacher was writing his dissertation, and on the frontier, and he was talking about, we were discussing slavery and Reconstruction as it happened in Texas, and then I'm thinking, yes, you get an idea of what was happening, or at least then. Then I read this incredible book that I'm reading right now by Ron Chernow on Grant. And my God, that just opens up such a new world on just the area of Reconstruction. And I mean, so it's layered. It gave me the foundation, even though I didn't, at the time I knew I didn't agree with my high school teacher about slavery, that they had it better because, that slaves had it better because at least somebody was feeding them. I knew that was not terrible. At least my church foundation, you know, told me that slavery wasn't good at all. And so, you know, you get, at some point, you get these ideas, these concepts, and they keep growing, and they keep growing. It's not all going to be given to you at that point, but, you know, seeds are planted, and you keep thinking about it, and it grows. And I think that's how we should think about that. These are seeds being planted, and they're not full grown, but they're growing, and they will flourish, hopefully.
Thank you.
And thank you for what you do.
Thank you.
My thanks also for all the work you do. Can we now move on to, okay, Ms. Colsman?
Yes.
Which means that you all can't yet say what you think of, but we can. And can we, Dr. Colsman, can we at least, in response, clarify what our questions would be about the proposed amendments?
Absolutely.
Is that okay?
Yeah,
Okay.
this is meant to be a time for the board to kind of discuss those amendments with the notion that, you know, the amendments should be kind of actionable language or replacement language.
Yes,
That then the
that was my
committees-
understanding.
Right.
Does that help, Dr. Scheffel? That's replacement language or
Right.
additional language
Right.
to the standards?
So then, with the idea that this is a public discussion, the public can hear what the board is recommending. There's an opportunity between this month and next month for the public to send any feedback that they would like, and then also for the committee to
Yep.
have adequate time to
Right.
respond.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Board Member Rain, you're on. And thank you for all your hard work on this one. Did you lose it?
No, I didn't lose it. I got it in my head. It's just coming out. First of all, I want to thank Stephanie Hartman. My amendment has to do with the United States citizenship test. I brought that forward, and Dr. Colesman and Dr. Cobb had a meeting with me with Stephanie Hartman, and she agreed that the citizenship test content should be in the standards, and she pointed out in the standards where every issue was that I brought up, which gives me more impetus to say we should give that test to high school students. They should pass that test. 100%.
Would you like
Not
to name,
yet.
would you like
No.
to name that civic-minded individuals instead of citizenship? I think.
It's called the United States Citizenship Test. That's what it's called.
Right, but because of how citizen is being used right now, would you mind if we maybe called it civic-minded individuals test?
No.
Yeah.
No,
Because that
it's
would,
the
it
United
would be
States
broader. It
citizenship.
would be broader. We're all citizens, so, but what is a citizen? A citizen is a civic-minded individual. And so it's not,
My amendment was for the United States Citizenship Test, but you may call it whatever you like.
right. Go ahead.
It's important to note that only 24% of the United States high school students are proficient in civics. Only 36% can name all 3 branches of the government, and a third cannot even name one. And I have to say, a lot of that is not limited to high school students. 2/3 of the students could not name one of their U.S. senators, nor do they know how many U.S. senators there are. Over the past several years, nearly 25 states have worked to address the crisis in civics education, and they've added the United States Citizenship Test to their state's high school academic standards or graduation requirements. And within the classrooms, within the states, within the districts, they have a lot of flexibility in what they put forward. For instance, Utah takes the 100 questions and they break it down into 50 questions, but you never know what those 50 questions are. I happened to be meeting on Monday, in fact, at the legislature, sat in on our education committee, and I had the test and I handed it to one of the students and one of the social studies teachers. Of course, the social studies teacher got them all right. The student only missed 2, which kind of shocked me because usually high school students don't know these, and she said, this was my high school teacher, so evidently she was taught well, the one that took the test. So this 100-question test is the one that the foreign nationals must pass before becoming United States citizens, although they don't take all 100 questions. They are given, I believe it is 10, and they have to get 6 correct, but they're not always the same 10. And 6 correct is 60%. I believe that our students, since they are citizens, should do better than 60%, although some states have tests that they give, and the students need to get 60% correct. And they may take them multiple times throughout high school. Some say they have to take them in grade 11 and 12 only. It varies, but they all feel the importance of the test. Now, the biggest pushback is we don't need another test. We have too many tests. In my mind, reading, math, and being a good citizen, I don't even know what comes first because they all are such critical skills. But I do think we need to have not the test. A test just says I could possibly memorize those answers. The test is what's behind those answers. And if what Ms. Hartman gave me, that it is brought up in all these different, she has every grade from 3rd grade, what's taught there, what's taught in high school, 5th grade, 6th grade. If it's true and these skills are taught, that test should be easy. And for some students it is. But there's no excuse for adults to get out in this world and participate in civic responsibility without having the knowledge. And I think we're doing an injustice by not teaching these students and holding them accountable to the knowledge behind this test. In 2016, there was bipartisan legislation run in Colorado to incorporate the test into a civics course, but a lot of education stakeholders thought it's better addressed in the revision process. So that's why I'm bringing it up. I met with CDE staff and decided to work within their draft standards of language and how it fits into the standards that are being revised right now. And instead of coming up with just a standalone amendment that doesn't fit in, we tried to put it into the same language that you are using. We're not alone in this quest. Polling indicates that 80% of the voters across political parties not only believe in passing the U.S. citizenship test should be not only be an academic standard, but actually support being a high school graduation requirement. Some states put an endorsement on the diploma saying the student passed the test. So in conclusion, demonstrating knowledge of this basic subject matter and having it be a part of Colorado's academic standards is an important first step to ensure all students are taught basic civics about how our government works and who we are as a nation and a state. Things every student should know to be ready for active, engaged citizenship. Thank you, and I ask for the board's support.
Madam Chair.
Okay, the amendments were attached to our stuff today, sorry about that.
Yeah, it's
So
all
here is a
red line.
scratch, it's blue line, but blue and red, and a clean copy. Board Member Goff?
May I ask, what I think is probably a technical question here?
Yes, we can ask,
Yeah,
we just can't hurt her.
probably best for the commissioner to start with, is there any, literally, is there anything technical about doing this? Putting a test, which is program, which is, some would say curriculum, which verges into the area of graduation requirements, perhaps, I don't know, into standards? Or are we, would we need to know, would we need to talk about where to put this? Should it become an expectation of Colorado kids? I'm just wondering how it fits in with what we have defined standards as being.
So I'll take the first shot at it, and then I might turn it over to Ms. Colsman, who knows the legalities of the definition of standards a little bit better than I do, or Ms. Hartman, I don't know. I mean, I will say we talked a little bit about this. I would say that this is probably an unusual thing. We usually don't articulate a specific test. So we were trying to figure out a medium, sort of a compromise approach to that. And so I think this, this would probably be a bit unusual compared to other standards because we don't outline that in any of our other documents. So it's a little unusual, but I don't think there's anything legally prohibiting us from doing that. And I'll turn to my team members to see if I got that wrong.
No, so Dr. Anthus, I think you've got it just right. I mean, I think it's kind of unorthodox is the word that I think I used, to have an assessment named within the standards. It is something that I think that we can look into a little bit more because we didn't ask it from a perspective of legal. I think we were just trying to, think about how do we achieve what we know that is important for Vice Chair Rankin here. And we may have an opportunity to perhaps connect with Julie about this question a little bit more in between and answer that question for the next meeting, if that's useful.
Board Member Rankin?
I also would like to put in the caveat there that civics is the only required course, and it's only, I don't know, what, half credit or whatever. I mean, it's kind of minor, but the fact that it is required, a lot of people say the state mandates things in this state. This is it. This is it. This is the bottom line, and I think we need to address it and put it in that important, at that important level. So that I just want to bring that part up.
Board Member Flores?
Well, I have to bring up this bit of history. I was in a committee meeting at the legislature across the street, and it was the Senate Education Committee, and I think one of the senators did try to get that test made into law. And that bill it failed, did not pass. So, I mean, can we overrule that here as the State Board of Education? Can we overrule the deed done over across the street and say they didn't pass it, but we will? Can we do that?
I guess we're gonna hear.
Well, Board Member Flores, just to be
That
clear,
was
I think,
that was Dr. Hill.
I think the way it is, the amendment is articulated now, well, actually, I take that back. Never mind. I just read it a little more carefully, so I have to process it a little more.
I'm reminded of the challenge that we have in Colorado because of our very, very strong local control. We had part of our ELC meeting on Monday. We had a former Commissioner of Education from Massachusetts who provided a very interesting and inspiring presentation. But it reminded me that the tools available in the Constitution in Massachusetts do not align with what we can do in this state. And so we have to, much as I appreciate learning what other states do, we always have to go back to what are our values, what is our Constitution. I'm constantly reminded that their civics requirement is unconstitutional. Nevertheless, nobody's challenged it, which I'm fine. But it does make for some very, very difficult challenges in terms of pushing the envelope anywhere else but at the local level. And at the local level, we know that the opportunities for inequities and inadequacies are great, which is why we're trying to do standards, but they're mushy and unclear because we don't want them to be thrown out as being curriculum. I mean, it's just not going to get easy for us. But you're going to figure it out for us next week, next month. Other comments, questions, colleagues? We have about 5 minutes left for science and math. Sorry, go ahead.
We should. I think we're cutting districts and schools short if we make comments that are pejorative, such as we know that, you know, nothing is going out there and we have to mandate it and such.
I said it
Well,
creates
it sounded.
opportunity. It creates opportunities for that to happen. I didn't say.
Well, I heard something else.
Okay.
And I think that there are some great things that are going out there.
Absolutely.
And so we just need to, you know, kind of keep our place and do those things that we can do and allow the districts to do those great things that they are doing and hopefully will keep on doing. So, thank you.
Board Member McClellan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a procedural question. I followed all of the procedural guidelines as they spoke to our responsibility, but I just want to be sure. Is there an opportunity for committee members to make commentary regarding the proposed amendments? Because one of my goals was to be as respectful as possible of the work that was done while balancing constituent input. So it would be valuable to me to get commentary if the committee wishes to give it on any amendments they wish to comment on between now and the next meeting.
That's what we've asked. That's what we have asked of them.
Okay, so
specifically. I hope.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Okay. So, Board Member Rankin, thank you for doing that. As an individual who at age 20 took the citizenship test, I've always liked it. A couple of us tried when I was on the board in my own community, which is where it is. Great opportunity, and that didn't fly. In fact, I even lost my little book that I'd had forever. But let's see what we can come up with here, please. And thank you to the committee members. Please pass on our appreciation.
Thank you for your time.
Dr. Cobb.
Yes.
Push us a little.
All right.
Please.
So at this time, we will bring up the members of our Science Committee.
science book.
No little break or anything?
No breaks. No breaks for you. She gotta walk.
No, I didn't mean walking. I did walk. Just a bathroom break.
All right, so as our committee chairs are starting to get settled, I would first want to make sure that I get an opportunity to do our introductions here. Two seats over from me is John Elfson. He is the assistant to the principal in Cherry Creek School District. Immediately to my right is Dr. Charlie Warren of University of Northern Colorado. He's a teacher education licensure officer. And in the middle is Dr. Joanna Bruno. She was our science content specialist. I guess she's sort of in the middle, kind of 2 seats over from me. Before we get moving into, waiting on the slide, into this presentation, I did want to make note that this presentation will actually happen in 2 parts. So I think I want to make sure that we state that information up front. The first half of the presentation, you'll have an opportunity to hear from me, really focused on providing some of the feedback that we've gathered with respect to the recommendations that have been offered, one related to the adaptation of the next generation science standards, and the other related to banding of the middle school standards. So once we get through with that portion of the presentation, then we will then transition over to our format that we've been engaged in over the past couple of meetings. So, all right. Here we go. All right, so as we've discussed a couple of times previously related to the recommendation of the Science Committee, the magnitude of it being a little bit different than some of the other content standards that we presented to you. We thought it would be really important to be able to get some feedback from the field as well as stakeholders throughout the state of Colorado in terms of this recommendation to make sure that everyone had a true opportunity to be able to weigh in. And so over the next couple of months, from March until May, we've actually made an effort to actually go around and physically meet with superintendents at the superintendent's advisory committees. Those meetings have been ongoing. In fact, we had an opportunity to speak with the committee today, albeit virtually. But we're in the process of continuing to move forward with those conversations to gather feedback, to get a real understanding of, and to hear from them directly about how they feel about this particular recommendation. In addition to that, Dr. Colesman had an opportunity to attend the CASE Winter Leadership Conference and was able to lead a focus group there to be able to gather some feedback. And our goal is in May to be able to present the outcomes of that feedback in the May presentation. So us having the opportunity to be able to have presentations both months, will be able to provide feedback. But today, what our goal is to be able to offer you a little bit of feedback related to a survey that was conducted pretty much over the month of March. And really the goal was, once again, to be able to gather feedback around that. And so we used our communication vehicles as best as we could to try and get as much feedback. It was a 24-item survey. And we were, although it's not, wouldn't meet the strictest of scientific scrutiny, I certainly think that it would be able to give us some feedback around what the constituents thought about this recommendation. So the slide that you're looking at right now is really just a pie chart in terms of the demographics of our respondents who were in the survey. As you can see, there were 913 individuals who participated. And the majority of the teachers, as you can see, a majority of the respondents were teachers at 59%, but the majority of the respondents who were teachers identified themselves as elementary teachers. And we thought that this feedback, this contextual point was really important because as we've started to gather feedback across the state, the teachers who feel that they would be impacted the most would be elementary teachers, because they tend not to have the depth of subject matter expertise as our middle school and our high school educators do. In looking at that, you can see our middle school teachers were about 17%, high school teachers 12%, and we were able to get kind of a broad representation of feedback of school administrators, folks from higher ed, and I see we even have a student who took the time to be able to respond. One of the things we wanted to make sure that we paid attention to around this feedback was really making sure that we were clear in hearing from the rural versus the non-rural perspective, really ensure that we got a clear understanding of what the impact might be. And so among the 900 or so participants, we had about 200 rural people who identified themselves as being from the rural parts of the state, which amounted to about 22%. So the slide that you're looking at right now is really one that kind of got to the question of what the opinions were of both the current Colorado Academic Standards for Science, as well as the opinions of the Next Generation Science Standards. Now, this survey was really broken down into two parts. The first question that we asked respondents was what their level of familiarity was with the standards. So we were really trying to make sure that we had a clear understanding of how familiar folks were. And so on the Colorado Academic Standards side of it, those who chose to respond had said that they were 87% of those who responded said that they were familiar. With respect to the Next Generation Science Standards, 65% of respondents said that they were familiar. And so in looking at this slide, while there aren't any numbers that are listed on top specifically, you can just see from the bar charts that there was a pretty large or pretty positive feeling for the Colorado Academic Standards in Science. However, there was also a very high feeling of positivity for the Next Generation Science Standards. Our elementary teachers who participated, those who were identified as elementary teachers, were a little bit less familiar. They had a familiarity of the NGSS at about 55%, but those who did respond to that question still had a positive view at around 75%. In looking at really trying to see if there was a distinction between our rural and non-rural participants of this particular survey, 83% of our non-rural participants had a positive view of the Next Generation Science Standards, and 77% of the respondents had a positive view, of our rural respondents rather, had a positive view of the Next Generation Science Standards. So as we looked at the feedback from the survey, one of the things that we wanted to pay attention to see was whether or not there was going to be any distinction between rural and non-rural. And throughout the questions, the trends tended to hold relatively similar. And that's been kind of the same in terms of some of the preliminary feedback that we've been able to receive across the field. Now, in terms of thinking about this change, in terms of concerns for what the implementation would actually require, in looking at some of the feedback that we received, the concerns have been largely the same in the fact that what folks have requested is really kind of time for implementation, as well as resources associated with implementation. I think that in terms of thinking about this transition, those who have responded to us have really talked about just the idea of that this would represent a change different from what they are currently doing. And so with that, it would take time for educators to get trained up. It would take perhaps an opportunity for curricular materials to need to be transitioned over, perhaps even a perception of a belief that they would need to buy additional science equipment in order to be supportive of their students. And so with that, while we started to look into the differences between the support versus, or rather balancing the support versus the concerns, one of the things that we were sensitive to is really trying to understand what might be ailing our folks as they move into this. And so the next slide, or the next chart that you'll see, really starts to focus on this real sort of essential question that we really tried to focus on was really kind of looking at do the benefits of this recommendation actually outweigh the drawbacks or vice versa. And as you can see from those who chose to respond to the survey, the majority of respondents have felt that the benefits do outweigh the drawbacks. And I will say that although we have not completed our tour around the state, what we are seeing, at least in this survey, is consistent with a lot of the feedback that we've received from the superintendents and from other educators across the state. Now, looking at those who who responded to this, I wanted to make sure that we continue to elevate the voice of those who may have had concerns about this, so that we could make sure that we could provide you with that information as well. And those who were really focused in terms of the drawbacks really kind of broke it down into a couple of different areas. One was, again, there was a concern about the transition from away from what they're currently doing into something new. And so as a result of that, that included the time associated with training and professional development, the cost associated with training and professional development, and perhaps new curricular materials, which wasn't dissimilar to what you had seen before. And really, if looking at some of the comments that were offered, there was just a concern about, there was even a couple of concerns about the challenge or difficulty of the standards, and I think those are more reserved for the elementary level than they were for the secondary level. And so, again, thinking about the distinction between the elementary perspective and the secondary perspective. So, moving on to the next slide, this then gets into the question of banding the middle school standards. And just so I'm clear with that, the committee is currently recommending not having the standards identified specifically by grade, i.e. 6, 7, and 8 in the middle school grades, but to have them banded as a middle school set, which is not dissimilar to the way that the standards are bound at the high school level. And so looking at that, we wanted to really kind of ask the question again, you know, what was the opinion of banding those standards, and really trying to get an understanding of exactly how individuals felt about that. And so again, as you can see from the chart, 46% of those who responded responded positively to this question. And I wanted to make sure that I broke this down in terms of looking at it from the distinction of the middle school versus the elementary and high. At the middle school level, that number was practically identical, 46%, or identical, 46% had a positive view. Elementary level, 32% were positive versus positive, and at high school it was 52% had a positive view of it. The rurals versus the non-rurals, it was 42% positive rural, 47% non-rural respectively. So just to give you a general sense that there was a relative balance in terms of that. So in terms of concerns and benefits related to banding, the major benefit was really just the flexibility that that the respondents felt that this particular choice would give. Really a lot of focus on local control in allowing for schools and districts to be able to identify exactly how they would like to organize their sequences for science in the middle school grades. The concerns, however, really focused on really, one, the uncertainty about how this would impact the assessment. Currently, the assessment is given in 8th grade and is focused on 8th grade standards. And so how the banding then would impact the decision to incorporate all standards certainly would be a conversation that would need to continue to be fleshed out. In addition to that, there was a question around the transient student population. So in other words, if a student were to move from one district to another district and the standards were bound, what would be the actual impact of that student either missing curriculum, or would that actually create a gap in experience? And then there was one additional point in terms of just from a content standpoint. I think there was a question around just the impact that would have specifically on the 6th grade. There were some questions in terms of whether or not sort of the content that had historically been reserved for students in grade 8 whether or not that content would be appropriate for students in grade 6. So those were by and large, the points and comments about the banding portion of the survey. And so I can kind of get into implementation options and considerations. Some of the things that have been discussed, obviously since this recommendation is much larger, there's a lot of things that can be considered. So at this point, I feel like I'm transitioning in 2 different ways. So what I want to do is give an opportunity to see if there's any questions or points of clarification that need to be made in terms of the survey before I transition it over to our committee.
I have a question. Do you by any chance have an example that you can give me of a concept, how it's done in the current Colorado standards and how it's changed under next gen standards? In other words, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. It's hard for me to think about the question. I mean, I have some questions, but I don't even know if they make sense since I don't completely understand the extent to which, and stay at the elementary level because that's as far as I can probably understand. Can you have an example?
Yes.
Do you have an example?
Yes, Madam Chair. One example we actually provide to superintendents when we go around the state for these meetings is around middle school physical science standard example. So the Colorado Academic Standards current example of an evidence outcome is to predict and evaluate the movement of an object by examining the forces applied to it. What the committee would be recommending would be to plan an investigation to provide evidence that the change in object motion depends on the sum of the forces of the object and the mass of the object. And within that would be the core idea of force and motion, the cross-cutting concept of cause and effect, and the science engineering practice of planning and carrying out an investigation.
So it's more inquiry. As we shift, I guess we at some point need to talk about how long a time we need for this shift. But do we have kids that lose some basic science understanding in the process of shifting from one to the other, and for example, being now in 7th grade and moving forward? Do we have concerns about that? Just as we did when we implemented the standards and changed the standards dramatically.
Sure, Madam Chair. In looking at the feedback, there was some feedback that was offered from some of the respondents that did bring up that specific question in terms of gaps that could be created. Obviously, anytime there is a change, a larger change in terms of standards, you wind up having students who have the information on the early years and don't get the information on the later years, or if you transition kind of wholesale altogether, just the transitional period that happens anytime large standard revisions are actually made. So that was a point of concern that was raised in some of the written feedback that was offered. I think certainly depending upon what the board's decision is, from a standpoint of implementation, that would have to be something that would have to be considered based upon whether or not the proposal moves forward. But certainly from a standpoint of implementation, that has to be a point of consideration to ensure that students don't get harmed.
So part of implementation would be try to mitigate any inadequacies by virtue of students having been in the system for a certain period of time and thereby have missed some of the new information.
Correct.
Colleagues, Board Member Rankin.
Mr. Cobb, how many teachers already use NGSS in our state?
Madam Vice Chair, I'll have to defer that over to our committee members. They'd be able to give me that information better than I could.
Board Member Rankin, we don't have an exact numbers of teachers that are using them. Districts have been using these standards or similar standards, and so it's hard to gauge the number of teachers. We have never polled that specifically.
Are we talking 50%, 80%, 10%?
That number is still hard to say. The larger districts, I don't want to speculate on a number at this time, but that could be a number we can try to get for you. But again, it's a moving target because districts are using them at different times. So identifying exactly who's doing that at this point I don't want to speculate on a number.
So these people that gave their opinions, I mean, that they really had positive and very positive, we don't know if they even use them. Is that correct?
Member Reagan, yes, that is correct.
Okay, thank you. And then my other question is, these standards are aligned with a test for science and teaching materials and curriculum that are already developed in, is this a package deal?
Again, I'd have to defer to our content experts for this.
No, Board Member Rankin, there is no set test. There's no package deal for these types of standards. The committee's recommend is an adaptation, but there is no current one test aligned to these standards. Different states are taking their approach to that at the local level.
So, thank you, thank you. So we are adopting the whole package of NGSS because that is to be adopted. The best way to put that forth is to take the whole thing. Is that not right? Do I have wrong information on that?
The committee's recommendation is not a full adoption.
What part, I mean?
If, Board Member, the committee's going to get, the chairs are going to get to what the committee's recommendation is. If, Madam Chair, would we be able to delay that until let the chairs provide what the recommendation is?
So it's not the full adoption?
It's not the full adoption.
NGSS?
No.
So when I was reading about it, I'm not reading about what we're going to hear. Is that correct?
I think, Madam Vice Chair, what we've talked about with the adoption is that we would put it in our format, which is a little different, and that the part that we would not be adopting is the engineering standards, because that was too big of a shift. So I believe that's what it is. But
so to get, I'm sorry, can I one more question? So to get whatever it is we are going to roll out, we do have a cost idea for that, how much it would cost?
Again, the cost exactly would be hard to speculate because different districts are at different positions of implementation of standards, so there's no one answer for a cost specifically.
Should we hold off on further questions until our guests make a presentation? I think I jumped the gun.
You're okay. If there are any further questions related to the survey specifically, I'd be more than happy to be able to get to that. But I also want to make sure that I'm able to defer to our guests here so that way they can provide the format.
That's not the survey, right?
Not the survey.
Okay. Hold your powder, please. If you'll go ahead and make the presentation, then we'll talk about the...
But it was just so...
Of course.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll go ahead on and turn over to our committee members. We will go ahead and follow the same format that we followed over the past couple of content areas, and we'll have an opportunity to hear from them and allow for questions beyond that.
Thank you, Dr. Cobb. My name is Charlie Warren. I am currently the University Licensure Officer working with teacher preparation candidates at the University of Northern Colorado. In my past career, over 40 years, I've been a superintendent, a principal, and primarily a science educator for that time. I would like to take a moment and thank the Colorado Department of Education and our committee. The committee is quite an esteemed committee. Of 20 members, they represent over 200 years of collective experience as teachers, administrators, district administrators, college professors, and on our committee is also a member of the National Board, the National Academy of Sciences, a board member of the National Academy of Sciences. They came from all over the state of Colorado, some of them making many, many hour trips for each of these meetings. And this has been a delightful year to work with these folks. Among these are also, I would like to point out, and came out a lot in our last meeting, that over half of these members are parents and grandparents of Colorado students, so they are deeply concerned about making sure that this is right. There are also many award winners, including National Board's certificated teachers, Presidential Award winners, Amgen Award winners, and many, many more. They are a thoughtful, professional, and serious group, and I would just like to humbly recognize them at this time. The charge to the committee at the beginning was taken very seriously and held as a boundary to our work, and that is that we were to review and be responsive to public comment, that we would review national and international benchmarks, including states specifically like Massachusetts and Virginia that have been right along with this work as we work, and a work from a group called WestEd that was commissioned by CDE specifically to look at our standards and to see how our alignment is with other countries and other states. More than anything, everyone on the committee is aware that we are now moving into a STEM world. The science, technology, engineering, and mathematics required of our students as they move into careers in STEM is very, very important. In addition, we're aware and worked very hard to pay attention to the CAP 4K legislation, including the inclusion of those Colorado essential skills, and we found a delightful place for that. The committee has recommended to you a set of revised standards that, in their expert opinion, are the best way for students to reach this goal. John?
So if I could, and again, good afternoon, Madam Chair. If I could just direct you, I think it's tab 5 in your notebook. We have, just like with social studies and math, we have a 2-page document that goes over the recommendations and the overviews. So each subcommittee member discussed thoroughly, each subcommittee members had to come up with recommendations, and they had spent substantial time reviewing and looking at the public comments and the benchmarking report. And essentially, after looking at all that data that we came up with, that was given to us, we came up with 3 issues with the 2009 Colorado academic standards. One is that they were not connected to research. 2 is that there were some gaps in sequencing, and there were some redundancies in sequencing as well. And lastly, which came out in both reports and was very loud, is that they did not include the science and engineering practices. So based on this information, we moved forward. The committee came up with the consensus to use the research-based K-12 framework for science education. This framework helped guide the committee with revisions. So one of the revisions was to make sure that we really laid out clearly what students needed to be able to know, do, and understand. And so when we're talking about what students needed to be able to know, these were progressions that started in kindergarten and went all the way up through 12th grade. They included things like ecosystems, chemical changes, plate tectonics, and forces of motion. Also, that we recommended that we had what students needed to be able to do. And so when we looked at what students needed to be able to do, we leaned on the science and engineering practices. These included things like asking questions and defining problems, analyzing and interpreting data, using mathematical and computational thinking. And so there we have the know and the do, and for the understand, we looked at the K-12 framework for science education, and we came up with the cross-cutting concepts, which includes things like cause and effect, energy and matter, structure and function. Once we had a nice layout of what students need to be able to know, do, and understand from kindergarten up through 12th grade, we had to draw our attention to the evidence outcomes. The evidence outcomes are a very important part of the Colorado academic standards. What the science committee found was what we were looking for and what we were asking for was evidence outcomes that had all 3 components: what students need to be able to know, do, and understand. This is what led the science committee to the next generation of science standards. As the committee began to address these changes of these evidence outcomes, it became very clear that these evidence outcomes would allow students to learn and demonstrate science content in the context of doing science and understanding how science fits into their natural world. These recommended changes from the committee truly improve, according to our committee, truly improve the quality of the Colorado academic standards. It allows students to engage with science more deeply and more connected to the natural world.
One of the things that I would like to highlight at this point is as we went through all of these meetings, we took many, many opportunities to check for consensus or concern. Because we had a year and several meetings to do this, this was a very, very important step in what we were doing. And as John was discussing about the next generation science standards, we stopped numerous times to say, where are you? Rural schools, how do you feel about this? Urban schools, how do you feel about this? Schools that are using the next gen standards, how are you feeling about it? Schools that are not, how are you feeling about it? We felt at all times that we provided space for these conversations. There were many times when we wound up in a bird walk for a long time to talk all the way through the concerns of the members of the committee. And these consensus checks were all very, very important. A couple of other examples of those that went with that and came from the committee was the treatment of engineering. The next gen science standards, if we went with a full adoption, would add another standard, and that would be engineering. And that simply is not something that schools are ready to leap off to yet. However, the practices of engineering are vital to the process of learning science education. Another example was as teachers and district administrators and college professors, some of the clarity that didn't seem to be there in the last version was around the concept of waves. So that prepared graduate statement was added by consensus from the committee. Another one that was brought up at absolutely every meeting is how will districts implement this? And that range of discussion has gone on and continues to go on. How will we implement these if they're approved? The last part is near and dear to my heart, and that is the impact of the grade banding at the middle school. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The grade banding aspect was one of those places where, as a member of the committee in the 2008 process, we felt that the grade banding at the middle school would have been a terrific opportunity to help schools take advantage of the expertise they have in their middle schools and using local control be able to arrange their concepts more effectively. And the committee, once we decided to go in that direction, came to strong consensus around that aspect. I would like, again, just to express my serious admiration and pride at the work of this group. Nobody held back, and it was really, it was hard work, and we've really enjoyed being there for it.
So if I could direct your attention back to the science standards overview. We went through the notable changes to the current standards at our last meeting, but those are there for you to review as need be. So I'm going to jump down to the responses to the board questions and the comments regarding the revisions. And then Charlie's going to also talk a little bit about not only the comments from public feedback, but some of the things changes that we made since we were in front of you last time. So on the left-hand side, you can see the state should, so the board, state board feedback or question. The state should consider use of general statements about consumption or of limited resources and awareness of consequences. These statements appear to be an attempt to shape how our kids are to think and our value leading to unintended and unanticipated consequences. So the response to the committee reviewed this recommendation and felt that though the standards met the expectation and have critically evaluated concepts have come to scientific conclusions based upon evidence. The second question from the state board was concerns about replacing the Colorado academic standards with next generation science standards. The committee feels it's important to note that there are substantial overlap of content between the concepts of the Colorado academic standards and the proposed incorporation of the next generation of science standards. The committee is coming forward with this recommendation after a great deal of thought and discussion. And just another opportunity to reiterate, this is really adapting, not a full adoption. When you look at what I call a GLE page, there are things on that GLE page that truly came from the K-12 framework for science education. Lastly,
The State Board feedback or question appreciated the quality of the work that was expressed, and the committee appreciates that comment. Thank you.
So some notable themes from the public comment, and that is in this chart that follows the one John was just reading. Some things we'd like to respond to. First of all, in public feedback, it said having grade level expectations written as questions is different than all other content areas. Questions that repeat across grades as GLEs could be confusing for districts and teachers. The committee considered this and agreed that it was important for science to follow the same format as other standards. So the grade level expectations were rewritten as statements. The committee also felt the questions, though still important, could be moved to the right side under elaboration of the grade level expectation. So they haven't been lost, they've simply been moved. A second concern that came up was again about implementation. I think that's on the tip of everybody's tongue on this one. The committee agreed and has had extensive conversations about the issue, and implementation is always an important consideration when revising the standards. Various comments in regard to certain concepts that needed to be in the 8th grade versus 7th or 6th grade levels and vice versa. A need for flexibility in the middle school because of various course structures. You may be aware that in some middle schools that are International Baccalaureate or Core Knowledge or various different curriculum types, they are not consistent with where our previous standards were. The committee organized these similar middle school trend comments into one section for response. The committee has updated the middle school standards by recommending the middle school be treated as a grade band similar to the high school. This would allow for greater local control and decrease concerns around implementation in the middle school. Finally, multiple requests for the inclusion of K-12 science education framework and next generation standards coding to support educators in finding resources more readily. The committee agreed with this and is recommending embedding the coding from the K-12 science education framework and the next gen science standards into the Colorado document to assist districts with alignment so they know where it came from.
Okay, at this point, that concludes the presentation section, and we'll turn it over to you for questions.
Thank you. Sorry I jumped ahead before. Colleagues, I can't remember who, were you next with a question?
Yes, and I remember.
Board Member Flores. Oh, thank you. I'm so glad. I apologize that I had to cut you off.
One of the questions that State Board member Joyce Rankin asked was about the cost of laboratories, chemistry, biology, physics laboratories and such. And I guess, I don't know, I go to some high schools here, and I just don't see very much of that. And this is Denver. So I would say that's something that we're going to have to think about. And this is not only in high school, this is in middle school and even upper grade elementary schools. So, I mean, I'm just thinking lots of money that's going to be needed if we're going to proceed, and we will proceed. But then, you know, how much money are we talking about here? Has anybody done any projections and amounts for what this will cost?
Board Member Flores, I did reach out to my national network and see what projections of costs would be. And what I got back was not any specific number. They put projections of costs in categories because they said it's really dependent on how the locals are implementing science at the time. So if your district, and we even got this when we were in the Pueblo superintendent's meeting, one of the superintendents said, well, our district does a lot of science, our costs would be different than a different district who is currently does not have a lot of science equipment. So it varies so much, it's hard to nail down an exact number, So thinking in hypotheticals would be difficult to do. They just categorized it by materials costs that are expendable, depending on what you're already doing in your district for science. As stated with social studies, a lot of districts at the elementary level are favoring mathematics and English language arts, so science is kind of taking a back seat also. So depending on how much what a district has invested already would vary. So the amount that they'll need to have in place for the revision of the standards will also vary then. So it's hard to give an exact number.
Right. And I'm thinking of libraries as well. I know some people will say, well, we have a computer that'll look everything up, but you know, I mean, I do research and I remember looking for this journal article in something and it's $17 or it's $25 or so. And you know, that's pretty costly. So when we're serious about this, I'm wondering if Ms. Rankin, whether the legislature has been thinking about this. I know you're
thinking they have money.
I'm sorry.
You keep thinking they give
well,
us
I'm
money.
sorry, but it is going to cost
So,
money.
added to that, let me ask you this. Some districts have, at every level, they have science labs. Some have FOSS kits that may or may not be. When this is being implemented, can these standards be aligned with a curriculum that varies how it's delivered? Or is there a one size that's necessary for next-gen standards?
With the standards themselves, it's not curriculum. And so this really is asking our teachers and our curriculum developers to look at structures to build processes in place in order for them to get there. So I guess the quick answer is no, it's not a package. And because we're looking at the outcome. And some of it really is taking some of the existing materials and really and flipping it around. Instead of doing a confirmatory lab where you might learn the science along the way and doing the lab at the end, we may put that lab on the front end where they're interacting with force and motion in order to generate some questions in order to come up with some explanations as they go. So as Joanna mentioned, there's different buckets of things. In some cases, the cost may be low. On other cases, it might be a little bit higher.
Right, so it's not going to be possible at the state level for this to be identified. It's going to have to be a district by district, a decision made how it's going to be implemented, and then identification of what the needs are. Okay, that helps.
But it's not going to be cheap.
Nothing is. Board Member Rankin?
So we already have some standards that were adopted in, I guess, 2010. And my first thought was, let's let the districts decide which ones they want to use. Because next generation science standards, which I know is not what you're talking about, however, the word I feel is used a lot, so I'm going to say I feel it is right there. And the answer to that I got from CDE was, no, we have to go with one or the other. So trying to see exactly where the changes are, it would take, as Dr. Shuffle says, you know, we'd all have to quit our jobs, which is right here anyway, and spend all our time evaluating that. When I went in, one of the things that was extremely confusing to me was definitions of terms that were very vague. And one of the terms was modeling. And so I went through Generation NGSS standards for the grade levels. And Ms. Birdsall, could you, Cordial, I'm sorry, could you put that other slide up? On the next generation standards online, they had used the word modeling 300 times. So I went through our good, and we used it 310. So this, and I don't know if you can blow it up a little bit, this is, all those lines are going around to show you what's connected to the different courses. And boy, I'll tell you, it's pretty obfuscating to me. This is from Next Generation Science Standards. you know, you don't buy something unless you know what the price is. And these waters are getting more and more muddied to me. And I know you put a lot of work on it, and I know that you understand what's going on. The way that is rolled out within the schools is going to be the biggest challenge. I have a hard time understanding why these teachers are have such a strong opinion if they haven't tried it or used it. And some of this you say, well, it's not next generation science standards, which are kind of aligned with Common Core. These are our own. They do overlap. We heard that before. We heard it in math and we heard it in English language arts, and we adopted that. And we heard the first thing this morning, the NAEP scores, the needle hasn't moved. I still think if some people want to try this, I think it's fine. But to completely throw out what we already have and adopt something that hasn't moved the needle in other areas, I just have difficulty with that. And I'll leave it.
Board Member Chappell.
Yeah, I was just, as you know, the Fordham Institute reviews standards nationally by subject area, and they had rated our science standards as a D. They rate NGSS as a C. Was there discussion on the committee that would explain why we would want to, it's a great opportunity since 2010, 7 years ago when we adopted standards, now we have a chance to rewrite them. Why would we adopt C-level standards? And when we look at the principles, the practices, and the knowledge, you know, it just, again, strikes me as very, the knowledge and the principle piece seems weaker than the practices. So the kids are doing a lot of things. This is consistent with, you know, the penchant towards student engagement, getting kids to do a lot of things, which is great. But if they lack the underpinnings and knowledge, I think there's issues with that. And it strikes me as really letting down our kids to adopt C-level standards when we have a chance to adopt A-level standards in science, given the need for STEM and excellence in science. Was there discussion on that?
There was no discussion that I'm aware of on the committee of the Fordham report. We didn't have access to that at that time. We have had an opportunity to review other state standards who have adopted full-on adoption of NGSS, and Fordham had rated them as A. So I'm a little confused when I look at the Fordham report of how they rated and why they're rated in those different grades. I agree with you. We want the very best standards for our students. And what the committee looked at was, what is the research that says what's the best way for students to know, understand, and do science? And that is, in their expert opinion, this revision is the best way to get there.
Well, so when we look at Fordham's report, and I know there are other entities that review standards, so they may not be the only one, obviously, but just in looking at their criteria and looking at the language of their critiques, they go line by line by line. So it's very instructive to look at, you know, when we're trying to do our amendments. I mean, just looking at it with the little time I had, there are some things that we could do to, I think, get at least to B or hopefully to A. So I guess I'd like to think that we had A standards in Colorado, given that we've had the others for 7 years, and now's our chance. So I guess I feel reluctant to end with C standards.
So the only possibility that or the only warning I would give would be that many of the reviewers look to states where the state can identify curriculum, and they love that.
Yeah.
And that's what we were talking about earlier, that we are limited in how much we can specify what the content is going to be. So that's just sort of a caveat when looking at that. Look and see if those are states where you can, in fact, go into much greater detail. Board Member Flores.
I just wanted to ask you, who has an A level in comparison to our standards? What states? What are the states that have A and B and C? A, B. And Fordham, I mean, I know
I mean,
Fordham.
what they would list would be California, DC, Indiana, Massachusetts.
Well.
For first five.
And
I'm
those are
assuming you
probably
guys all looked at those, right?
Yes, we did.
Yeah.
And those are probably curricula states too. I mean, Massachusetts. California.
Not all, yeah, not all.
I'm sorry?
I think 2 out of those are.
Maryland? So,
Other questions? Board Member Rankin?
One of the controversial items in this is evolution and climate change. And I don't know if you discussed that, but I know evolution's 40 times in the document, climate change is 16, and in a lot of areas, those parts are taken right out of NGSS. And actually, I was approached and said, if we take those out, will you approve them? And I have a hard time even answering that question. I mean, but these are times where things are discussed and discussed openly, and I don't think we should hide some of that discussion. I just wanted to bring that forth, unless you have a response.
And climate change and evolution were in the 2009 standards, and the committee did have that discussion, that conversation, and the committee agreed to keep the concepts within the new standards. So yes.
yeah. I mean, we're not going to be Kansas.
Any other questions?
We don't want to be Kansas.
So I'm wondering, colleagues, thank you very much, first of all, for all your hard work. We look forward to seeing you again next month. Sorry about that.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you. Can I hold us to a 5-minute break, given that we're on a really tight schedule, please? Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, we can have amendments. So please do that. This one has a long.
Do you have amendments?
Yep. So busy will Thank you. Dr. Cobb, you're on.
All right, it gives me, there we go. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our mathematics committee. To my right is our committee chairperson, Joni Funderburk. She is the president of the Colorado Council of Teachers of Mathematics. And to her right is Raymond Johnson. He's our mathematics content specialist here at CDE. And at this point, I will turn it over to, I believe, Joni, and we'll go through the process that we've continued to go through.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much again for the opportunity to share the work of the Mathematics Standards Review and Revision Committee. I appreciated the opportunity to share with you in November and to be back with you today. If you look in the first tab of your binders, you will find the list of our committee, and I would just like to point out that the committee represented teachers, mathematics specialists, and administrators from across Colorado, and this was an amazingly dedicated group. I can't speak to the countless hours we spent together in person and working virtually to present what we believe is a very strong product. I also want to let you know that we engaged in very constructive dialogue and ensured that the perspectives of all of our committee members were represented in all of the issues that we talked about. We had a great training from the Department of Ed for processing, group collaboration, and for reaching consensus, and those protocols allowed us to work through more challenging conversations. This group of very professional, experienced, and committed stakeholders worked to be confident that our final recommendation reflected the needs identified by the benchmarking report, the focus groups, and the public comment about the mathematics required for college and career readiness. So under the second tab of your binders, if you look at page 4, you will see that the mathematics standards are broken down into 4 standards categories. Those are number and quantity, algebra and functions, data, statistics, and probability, as well as geometry. And then you'll find the set of standards included behind tab 2 is organized first by grade, starting with preschool, and then organized by those 4 standards within each grade. So that gives you some reference point for the organization. So as the other committee chairs before me, I'm going to start by sharing the notable changes to the standards. So if I could refer you to that document. And again, I went through these when I was able to meet with you in November, but I'll just review them again quickly. Applicable to all grades, we shifted the expectations specific to personal financial literacy to social studies and the economic standards. We consolidated some evidence outcomes. All of those related to measurement and data now live under Standard 3. We changed some of the titles on the right side of the document. Colorado Essential Skills and Mathematical Practices, Inquiry Questions, and Coherence Connections are now our 3 categories of supporting content on the right. And then we revised the right side of the document, the content there, for a greater focus on the math practices and on coherence within and across grades in mathematics. Specific to high school, we wanted to and succeeded in increasing clarity about the content expected for all students versus content for advanced work in mathematics. And we added the expectations for advanced mathematics, and you'll see those denoted with the little plus symbol parenthetically at the end of the evidence outcome. In response to feedback from the members of the board, we had one comment about emphasizing efficiency and accuracy. The committee discussed this and finds an appropriate balance of efficiency and accuracy. We call that fluency. That's where you'll see that word fluency in the standards. And we find that balanced with conceptual understanding of mathematics. The committee agreed that both are important for students to be able to apply and extend their mathematical knowledge to college majors and careers. So we were going to keep that balance as it exists. Additionally, we reviewed a couple other board recommendations and concerns that aren't listed on this document, but I would like to let you know that the committee was provided a comprehensive list of the critiques of the Common Core, and we reviewed those prior to our first meeting and had extended discussion about those critiques and how we would address them in our revision. We were also made aware of concerns regarding the language and communications requirements that are within the standards, and a concern that those might be conflated with the mathematics at certain grade levels. So we discussed that concern as well, And we determined as a committee that mathematical communication is an important practice in becoming a mathematician and a mathematically literate citizen, and that the expectations to develop this discipline-specific communication needs to remain in the standards. Next, on the other side of that document, some notable changes based on public comment. The primary concerns that emerged from the second round of public feedback are summarized in this table for you. The committee made edits to the prepared graduate statements, and that prompted our responders to suggest that the standards for mathematical practice would be more coherent and meaningful as the prepared graduate statements. So we did go ahead and make that change. In all rounds of public feedback, from the very beginning of the process up till the end here, we have heard concern about some of the specific content in high school and that it should be designated as advanced content. So we evaluated each of the evidence outcomes that received that indication and talked about that content to ensure that if we were to reassign those or redesignate those evidence outcomes as advanced, that we wouldn't be lowering the rigor of college and career readiness for all students. As a result of that intensive review, I think there were about 37 altogether that we reviewed, and we did change 10 of them to be advanced evidence outcomes for high school. We also had some feedback regarding the consistency and quality of the academic context and connection. So we spent a significant amount of time in these last few months reviewing those right side pieces and getting more consistent quality across all grades and standards. And finally, the committee considered and added connections between math content and the literacy requirements of reading, writing, and communication where those were appropriate. So that summarizes what I would like to share with you.
Thank you.
We'll open it up to questions.
Colleagues? Board Member Goff?
Excuse me. Just prior, the science group was talking about banding at the middle school level. Is there any impact, any two-way impact on math as well, if that's, as far as STEM is concerned? If the math is banded or not, or you know, various curricula, or a school's approach, whatever looks at doing it that way, is there any impact on the course work?
Yeah, that's not a question I can answer right now, but definitely something that we would look into. There are, of course, connections between math and science and the content requirements. I can speak from my experience as a math educator across the years that typically the math requirements at the standard level are a couple of grades ahead of science, so that the math that students would be engaging with in their science class is typically math from 1 or 2 grade levels before. But it's definitely something our committee can take a look at.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this work. This is fascinating.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Board Member Sheffield.
Thank you. When you were working with the committee and you said you reviewed the critique of the Common Core standards, which math is like 85% Common Core in Colorado, did you go through those critiques and then adjust the language? You know, the issue of when algebra gets taught, the issue of computation and automaticity. I mean, there's just really critiques that are very detailed about the standards. And I just wondered if, I was just looking through the redlined version. I don't know that I saw each of those really addressed, or did you consider them and then agree not to address certain ones, or what was the committee's thought on looking at those critiques against what we have had since 2010?
So the comprehensive report that we reviewed includes some broad critiques, some around, for instance, grade level appropriateness, without specificity to standards or evidence outcomes. And so we had discussion about those and included some of the rebuttal arguments about that. We found within a single critique document what felt like conflicting critiquing information. One said it's not developmentally appropriate and another said not rigorous enough.
Good
So
luck.
we sort of felt like those balanced each other out as critiques. In the cases where we were given specific critiques of specific language, of specific standards or evidence outcomes, we did address those on an individual basis. In some cases, we did change the language slightly. In some cases, we attempted to add clarity using the coherence connections, inquiry questions, and the whole right side of the document to add clarity to the understanding. And in many cases, we found critiques suggesting that content wasn't there that actually is. So I have some notes to that. If you have any specific questions, I'd be happy to refer to those.
Can you speak to algebra? Because that's been such a controversial issue that should be taught in 8th grade. In our standards, it looks like it's kind of punctuated. You can look at that language even in younger grades. But I mean, the whole issue of the pre-calculus readiness is a big issue. Can you speak to that? Is that rectified?
Sure, absolutely.
Did anything it didn't need to be? Or?
I think one thing that adds confusion around this conversation is the loose term or the loose use of the term algebra. Algebraic thinking is something that exists in the standards as early as kindergarten. When people talk about algebra in 8th grade, I think they're referring to a course. And again, in Colorado, our previous standards and these standards don't delineate content that should exist in a course. I can sort of speak about my experience as a math educator. When we first adopted these standards in 2010, my review of them and with the content experts that I work with, we found, in fact, did a whole cross-referencing table and found that about 70% of what we previously taught in a 9th grade Algebra 1 class was now included in the 8th grade standards. So I recognize that concern is there. My perception, and again, happy to talk about the specifics, the majority of content that students need to have in 8th grade in order to be on track for pre-calculus preparedness, as you described it, it's absolutely there.
Any other questions? Dr. Scheffel, you got all your concerns? Okay. We're good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Colesman?
So
Got it. You're good.
Okay. I can only speak when this is in my hand.
Really? I wish I had something like that.
So I thought there was one more slide. I don't think there's one more slide. Okay. Oh, you did.
Yes, I did.
That's, yes. We appreciate the time with the board today. We recognize it was a long presentation. We know that it will be standards pretty much all day, all the time between now and June. So we, just as you have expressed appreciation to our committees, we express appreciation to you because we know that this takes a lot of your time and a lot of homework on your part. So where we go from here, at our May meeting, we'll be bringing forward the social studies and math standards for action. Keep in mind that while science was here as an information item, again, we're not going to do an action item until June for science to give additional time for discussion, answering of questions. And at the May meeting, we'll also be providing you with a summary of what we've heard at the different superintendent's advisory councils about the science standards. So that's what's on the horizon. We'll be reminding you of dates for submission of amendments for the May meeting, which will be by the agenda posting date for the May State Board meeting. And if there's any questions that you have or any meetings that you'd like to have with staff, we are more than happy to do so.
Okay, thank you. Board Member Scheffel.
So then is it true that for math and social studies, all the amendments are in and we can't ask for any additional or reduction of language in the current versions, is that right? And then in terms of the science, if we were submitting amendments, they may or may not be reflected in the final version presented to the board because they have to go back to the committee for review. And though we might make a suggestion,
No, no, no.
your committee
No,
would
I'm
say
sorry.
yes or no.
You know, you're at a disadvantage because I'm not sure I've completely clarified the amendment process, which is that we submit the amendment and we listen to feedback from the committees, et cetera. However, we do vote on those amendments, so they don't disappear. We do a separate vote. So next time, when we vote on social studies, we will vote on the amendment about the citizenship test. So then it'll be up to us whether we want this amendment to go in or not go in.
Okay, and any other additional or reduction of language in the science standards would need to be submitted before the next date, and then that would be voted on, is that right? Okay.
In May.
In June, and then.
June, thank you. June.
And then the
Right.
current feedback on math and social studies exists in the record, but it can't represent an amendment, is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
Unless you can pull something together.
Well, it's fairly specific, but I would have to sit with staff and rewrite.
That's
or
correct.
redact,
Mhm.
which I'm
That's-
willing to do if anyone thinks that it would be, if anybody has time, I guess. We can discuss it.
Okay, let's discuss that, because I'm trying to accommodate
Yes.
the fact that you've got time, but it just needs to be extremely soon, please. Thank you, Mike. Thanks also to your whole committee, and thanks to staff. Appreciate it. The next item. What? Everybody got out alive. Yeah, that's true. Wait till next time.
They're all alive.
Next item on our agenda is the consideration of rules for the administration of the accreditation of school districts 1 CCR 301-1. I ask that staff give a brief presentation before I take a motion. Commissioner, or maybe we need to wait for a dance shift.
A little shift, but I think,
Oh, poor Miss Colesman.
yeah, I mean, thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, this has been the Melissa Colesman Show.
And my co-star.
And your co-star,
Dr.
right?
Dr.
I
Cobb.
know. But, yes, so I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Colesman and Lisa Medler to just give us an overview of this quickly and move forward.
Okay,
Or
so-
is it?
No.
He's absent.
Okay. So, Madam
Oh.
Chair, members of the board, does he have the amendment?
We have another copy.
We have another copy if anyone. Oh, give it to me if you would, please.
Okay.
Oh, I forgot about that. And I don't, he might be back in a minute, but.
Okay, just in case.
Got it.
Okay. So, Madam Chair, members of the board, so Lisa Medler, Executive Director of Improvement Planning, and myself are here to present to you the rules for accreditation. This was brought about by a bill that passed in the last legislative session that requires the inclusion of an early childhood needs assessment for districts and schools that are on the lowest two tiers of our accountability system. The term needs assessment, we know, brought up a few questions at the last meeting, but really if you think about this more in terms of requiring schools to look at a scan of early childhood services that are available in their community, that may help a little bit with the language or an understanding of the intent here. For the supporting materials, you should have a memo. You should have two versions of the rules. One is a red line, and I think it might actually be red, which is nice. And we also have a clean version for you to reference as well. There's also a crosswalk of rule to statute to reference. At the last meeting, there was a few questions specific to section 7.03 parens D parens 3, which is the addition for the specific aspects to align rule to statute. And since the last meeting, there is an additional statement that is in reference to a concern brought forward by Board Member Durham, and this is statement 7.03 parens D parens 3 parens Roman numeral I. that would ensure that districts and schools would, that it would be clear that it does not authorize them to or require a school district to ask for information from private early childhood education providers. There is similar language also added in the section 10.10 parens D parens 3. And in this case, it's specifically the very last statement, 10.10 parens D parens 3 parens I. And again, that same language that would require a school to collect information from a private early childhood provider. So we believe that with these two additions that we've addressed the board concerns, and we're here to answer any other questions that board members have about the rules.
Thank you. Board members, do you have questions? Could I have a motion then, please? Please. After the motion.
I move to approve the rules of the administration of the accreditation of school districts, 1 CCR 301-1.
So before we vote on that, Board Member Durham has proposed an amendment, and so we want to first look at that amendment, and I'll make that motion. I move to make the following changes to 1 CCR 301-1. At the end of the sections that we were just talking about, 703 D3I and 10.10 D3I, add the following sentence. Any request for information from a private provider must, in clear and conspicuous language, explain that the compliance with the request is voluntary. Is there a second to Mr. Durham's
The last
amendment?
3 words.
The request is voluntary.
They don't have to do it at all?
Actually, it's the answer that's voluntary, right? Oh, I'm sorry. That compliance with the request is voluntary. So it wasn't in the last 3 words.
Second.
Thank you. Any comments on that, colleagues? Could you call the vote on the amendment?
On the amendment, yes.
Please.
Board Member Durham is excused. Board Member Flores?
Hi.
She's thinking.
Oh.
I'm thinking, I'm
Okay.
just thinking.
Sure, hold one
We
moment.
we didn't have a discussion.
All right, let's go back and have a discussion. I thought I
Just a
did
clarifying
ask.
question. I
Board
just-
Member
Oh,
McClellan.
especially with
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to confirm my understanding. This doesn't change the impact of the law. This is mainly for the sake of notification so that those who would comply or not comply are aware of their option to do so or not do so. Do I understand that correctly?
Madam Chair. The amendment's really, it's focused on clarifying that if there is a private early childhood operator that does not receive public funds, that they are not, there's nothing in law that obligates them to provide information, and it's just clarifying in the rules that they do not need to, and it's voluntary on their part. So it's not the whole thing, it's just that small
Okay.
subset of early childhood
So
providers.
it's not changing their requirement with respect to whether or not to comply. It's merely ensuring that they have that extra step of awareness of
There-
their already existing right. Is that right?
Yeah, the requirement is really around schools and districts doing the needs assessment. If in doing the needs assessment, they need to, they want to collect information from others, they can do that. If they want to collect it from private, there's nothing in here that's requiring them to do that, and that the private providers that do not receive public funds can say, thanks, but no thanks, we don't want to submit any information to you.
And not to beat a dead horse,
Yeah.
but may I have confirmation from our legal counsel? Am I correct? Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, then I have no issue with this, and
I
we'll
have no
probably
issue.
vote yes.
So are we back to voting, or do you have some comments?
No, I understand it.
It's a yes?
It was that,
You're a yes. Okay.
yes, I'm a yes vote.
Thank you, Madam, or Board Member Flores. All right, Board Member Goff.
Yes. Yes, thank you.
Board Member McClellan.
Yes.
Board Member Rankin.
Yes.
Board Member Shuffle?
Yes.
And Board Member Schroeder?
Yes.
That amendment passes 6-0.
And now, could we have a vote on the motion itself, the original motion?
I believe I need a second for the original motion.
Oh, I second it. Great. I guess everybody seconded it. did.
We've got lots of seconds. Seconded it.
You have a choice. Pick anybody.
So Board Member Durham is excused. Board Member Flores?
Yes.
Board Member Goff?
Yes.
Board Member McClellan?
Yes.
Board Member Rankin?
Yes.
Board Member Shuffle?
No.
Nope. And Board Member Schroeder?
Yes.
And that passes 5-1.
All right. We're on action item 17. Last item on our agenda today is the consideration of West End R-2's request for certification of a multi-district online school for the Colorado Online Academy. I ask that staff give a brief presentation before I'll accept a motion.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to turn this over to Bill Cottonsetti and Renee Martinez to give an overview of the issue.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
It's almost like good night.
Yeah, we're getting close.
Good evening.
So I'm going to go over some of my notes just to frame for you. So each year, authorizers may apply to the state for multi-district online school certification. The process is established in state board rule. The state reviews applications twice per year, and submissions are accepted no later than January 2nd and April 1st. So that's a routine process. The Online and Blended Learning Office received one application this year by the January 2nd deadline. That application was submitted by West End RE2 on behalf of Colorado Online Academy. The office then conducts a review. The application criteria is established in state board rule. The office's recommendation is based on an evaluation of the application against the standards that are set in rule. On the first application, there were identified gaps in the application that did not meet the standards set within the rubric. In these situations, authorizers are provided an opportunity to respond and address the gaps. West End responded with revisions. The second review determined that West End met the quality criteria as specified in rule. Thus, based on application review and the processes directed to the online office in rule, the recommendation is to approve the application for certification. Materials were provided to you that include the original application, the first review rubric, the district response, and the second review rubric, and the corresponding application appendices. In addition, we provided you a letter submitted by the superintendent of West End, along with additional information provided by West End regarding the current and past performance of the proposed education service provider A3. We would like to open the floor to your discussion and to answer any questions that you have.
Colleagues? Come on, Rebecca. Board Member McClellan, you're ready.
If possible, can staff touch upon some of the concerns that we have learned about from members of the community concerning the advertising for student enrollment in not one, but 4 online schools run by this provider?
Yes. So concerns were brought. I heard them in public comment earlier today. We did look into the concerns that were brought forward, and what we can report to you is that we did confirm that the school is active in recruiting students right now. That was identified on their website and in conversations with the provider. And the response that they provided is they are doing recruitment as they feel other schools would be doing at this time of the school year. The school also communicated that their perspective is that the enrollment is a preliminary enrollment. They are proposing to save a seat for students but that preliminary enrollment is not binding, meaning that they are not viewing the students as ineligible to enroll in other schools. Should the school not be approved, the school said that they would assist students with finding other education settings. There were also concerns brought forward about the idea that there were 4 schools advertised, and that that West End has only sought certification of 1 school called Colorado Online Academy. So we did some research on that, and we did find posted on their website that they do advertise for 4 separate schools: Colorado Online Academy, Colorado Tech, World Language Academy, and Uplift Colorado. We discussed this with the school, and the school says that the other schools that are identified, so Colorado Tech, World Language Academy, and Uplift, are tracks that fall under the umbrella of Colorado Online Academy. Their claim is that this is a strategy that is used by other online schools, where you have one school that has different names of programs underneath it. But what I can say from the advertising is that they are represented as schools. I will note that in the application to the state, we were not aware of these tracks, and so this was new information to us. But the website that they have advertised does imply that they are schools.
And it's our information that the information that we've received in the last week or so was also not information that the superintendent had. Or that is information the superintendent did not have. That's a poor sentence.
Okay. I don't know.
Can you state your question again? I apologize.
It's our understanding that the superintendent is as surprised about the additional information that's been brought forth recently as we were just in this last few days. Correct. Is that correct? Yeah. Board Member Scheffel. Okay.
My brief follow-up is for Ms. Tollison. I noticed that we have proposed motions, and under motion option number 3, in the event that a board member were to choose that option, the recommended language with respect to a specific reason, would the irregularities highlighted just now qualify as a recommended reason that would be a sufficient citation within that motion?
I believe they would, yes.
Okay, it might be helpful to have developed language that's recommended in the event that a board member chooses to make that motion.
Okay.
Board Member Scheffel.
I appreciate the work this rural district is trying to do to address the needs of their students. My question is there, can you speak to why they chose A3 to work with, and then what criteria they will use after the 2-year probationary period to continue? And I don't know if that detail is in your materials. I'm trying to look at what I received, but can you speak to that and also to the data privacy issues?
Okay. I don't know if you can speak to the choice of A3 as a vendor.
So it is within the application in the ESP section as to why they chose that vendor. Let me review it real quickly, please.
And then remind me on your second question.
What criteria will they use after the 2-year probationary period as to whether they'll continue with this provider?
Okay.
And then thirdly, are they in compliance with the data privacy laws of our state?
So in the response, in the letter that was provided by the superintendent, and I apologize, it's over here.
We have our run packet to share.
He stated that the district negotiated a 2-year probationary period that would be revisited to ensure that the ESP and the district would hold each party accountable to the terms of the agreement. So the language is pretty broad, but there is a management agreement that is included in the appendices that's more extensive, that goes into detail on in terms of the agreement. So my interpretation of that would be that they would both come to the table and say, are you authorizer meeting the terms and commitments that you've made, and we want to continue with you, And the authorizer would say, did you, education provider, meet the terms as specified in this contract, and do we want to continue with you?
Okay.
Yeah.
Did they address the data privacy? I'm just looking for it, but I don't know that was addressed directly.
Yeah, Board Member Shuffle, while they're looking, my guess on that is just our rubric and our standards were aligned probably before the new data privacy bill passed. So I do think there's an expectation that we have with anybody moving forward that they meet any current laws that are included in that. But I think you raise a good point, which is that we may want to review, because we haven't reviewed the standards for reviewing multi-district online applications. That may be something we want to add, so it's more explicit in the application.
That's an agenda item coming up, if we ever get through June.
So in looking at their choice of education provider, in the application, and I'm referencing the original application, on page 25, they provide an explanation in answer 3.1. And it says that the district desires to provide enhanced education options for in-district and out-of-district students, and that their belief is that A3 as the provider would support them with accomplishing that.
So fairly broad.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And then on the data privacy, there is an element in the rubric that we do evaluate that, but as Commissioner Anthos said, it wouldn't hurt to reevaluate and make sure that we're meeting to the more recent standards.
Right, thank you.
Board Member Flores?
I just wanted to ask, but don't we have about 17 online providers already in the state or so? 15? How many do we have? Maybe is that correct?
So we have 27 multi-district online schools. There are private providers that some of them contract with. So anywhere from 4 to 5, K-12, Connections Education, some education groups. So there's a variety of providers in addition to the number of online schools there are currently.
And from my reading of this proposal, or from what we had here, I'm not comfortable in voting yes for another online school that doesn't have a track record. And given that the provider has not really, I think, acquainted himself with our rules right now, and I know we're going to acquaint ourselves as well, or we reacquaint ourselves with the rules. I think we would kind of be doing our kids a disservice if we were to grant this application. So I will be a no vote on this. I'm sorry.
You ready on a motion? Ms. Tolzman, you got some language for us?
I do not yet because I'm tracking it to the rule. But if you can help me identify which of the issues you've heard you feel like are the most salient for your findings, I might be able to give you some language.
Go.
As I understand it, the irregularities surrounding the advertising of what appears on the online advertisement to be 4 separate schools, while the institution is still seeking final approval of one school, together with the information that the superintendent may not have been aware of this irregularity, if I understand correctly, and if I'm not understanding that correctly, let me know. And then further, it might be helpful if staff is aware if there were any inconsistency with respect to information on student outcomes when we compared what was initially reported to us to what we then later discovered upon further inquiry, if you think it's relevant.
Can we just say irregularities?
Yes.
Of the vendor?
Okay.
Go for it.
That would be acceptable as well.
So make the motion, please.
Oh, just say irregularities. Oh, very good. All right. I move to deny West End RE2's request for certification of a multi-district online school for Colorado Online Academy for the following reasons. Irregularities in the application on the part of the vendor. Or irregularities on the part of the vendor.
I'm
I'll
hoping
change to
that's a
that
proper
latter.
motion, in which case I seek a second.
I second it.
Thank you. Any more discussion? Call the vote, please.
Board Member Durham is excused. Board Member Flores?
No?
Wait a minute.
I think you
We're
want to.
denying.
Oh, we're denying it. Yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Board Member Goff?
Yes.
It's a long day.
Board Member McClellan?
Yes.
Board Member Rankin?
No, with all due respect to the superintendent and blended learning, I think it just needs a little more time, so I'll be a no vote.
Board Member Shuffle?
No.
And Board Member Schroeder?
Yes.
The motion passes. Let's see, 4-2.
Next item is for the board to consider any other business. Board Member Rankin?
Yeah. I have a couple of things. First of all,
Thank you, guys. Sorry.
Thank you very much.
We're just
thank you.
trying to get through.
I want to bring our attention to the State Board of Education Award recognition proposal. Board Member Durham brought this up, that we need to have a list of the awards that we give out at our board meetings. And little known to some of us, some of these are in statute, so we have to do some of them are not. And what CDE did was they listed them all, the awards that recognize academic achievement or direct contributions to academic achievement, awards that are required by statute or national program rules, and then third was major student education and or school awards. So we received this, and I don't know if you all had an opportunity to read it. Do they all have it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
We
And-
emailed this at the end of March to you all, the list.
Right.
Didn't
Okay.
realize it was intended to be an agenda item today.
It's not an
It's
agenda.
not an
It's not an
agenda.
agenda item.
Okay, then
So we're just talking about it.
We're just talking.
Not prepared to talk about it. I don't know my stuff.
It was too much stuff. So, I have just one question that I would like to bring to our attention, and that is the third part, major student educator and/or school awards. I'd like to know who determines that. Is that going to be something that'll be brought before the board, or is that something CDE just recommends? That was my only question, but other than that, I was very impressed that we got this. I thought it was very interesting.
Board Member Rankin, yes, I think we just tried to put together some criteria for this award. There's actually many more awards than this. So what we tried to do was organize the awards so that in things that were a little more substantive, it's the end of the day, substantive, for you all to recognize. So I think really that's a judgment call that staff made if it was a major student or educator award. So the example today, the Millikan Educator, that's a very substantial national award that Board Member Goff is even involved in selecting, and so that's sort of substantive. We would say the same thing for possibly student awards if they received national accolades in something that was nationally recognized. And then some of those other things maybe the department would recognize or the commissioner would recognize, but wouldn't need to bring it to the board level. So it was a judgment call.
Okay, thank you. I don't, this is just an informational item, is that correct? Or do we need to vote on that at some time?
I don't think so. It was just for your information, and if you had any questions or wanted it to become an agenda item, you could let us know, but it seemed as though folks were okay with it, so.
Is this posted on our CDE site by any chance?
It's not.
Okay. It was very interesting. Thank you for putting it together.
Board Member Goff?
Well, there are, I large handful of awards that we have prior to now given that all of a sudden are not on that list anymore. And I guess the opportunity to talk about it would be my request, because I don't understand. I don't understand the omissions all of a sudden. I'm having trouble lining up where these are department given awards with the Colorado Department of Ed, or a name of a unit here at the department that recognizes achievement in certain areas, other things like that. I just, I don't know, I think, and it could be done on, you know, even on a whoever wants to talk basis, however you want to handle it. But it's hard to understand, and it's hard to explain to people why all of a sudden, one example I'll give is we have honored or recognized the linguistically diverse administrator of the year. Some school where the principal has led a great effort of improvement in ELL, ELL teacher of the year, or ELL school of the year, and that's not on this list right now. That's all. I mean, that's why
And maybe
I reacted as this is kind of a surprise today, and I've been ready to talk about it. I just didn't realize we were going to have to do it today.
Board Member Flores.
Can we name another topic, or I mean, I
Well,
think this would be something maybe for later to discuss?
Sure. Anytime.
Retreat, maybe.
In a retreat, yes. But I have another concern, and my concern has to do with what all of you have been reading about recently, and that is with Facebook. And the department has a Facebook account. I have a Facebook account, and I'm concerned for the department. I'm glad you're here, Jill, because of I mean, we have so much data, and
it's not on Facebook.
Well, we have a Facebook account, and I don't know. I mean, the national association of what is it? Not NAEP. Up in Colorado had they have their own. It's the National Association of, is it evaluation? A policy, the policy in education. And, they kind of had an article that was taken up by the Washington Post, and it just gave explicit reasons why they were not going to be on Facebook anymore. And I'm thinking the department has so much information. Is there any way? Now, I'm speaking from someone who, connects the computer and doesn't know how it gets there or whatever. I couldn't explain to you any such thing, so you're computer idiot here.
Julie calls us Luddites.
I'm sorry, a Luddite?
Luddite, that's what you call us, isn't it?
Have I said that?
Yes, you have.
Well, but,
some of us.
So of course, I'm concerned if this organization has done this and we're tied up to it. I mean, I think I always give my opinion, and hey, it's out there. But what about, I don't have a lot of data, that people can take, but the department does.
Thank you, Board Member Flores.
They know all about you, Dr.
Yeah. Well,
They know everything.
she doesn't have a Facebook account.
I don't have a Facebook
I know.
account.
But Board Member Flores,
We need to talk about it.
yeah, we can sit with you and work with you to see our Facebook account. We don't put any
No,
of
I
our
know,
data
and
on
I
there.
like it. I like it, but is there any way for them to go?
Sneak
No.
around the corner.
No,
Yeah,
not
and
to get
sneak
to
in.
our,
Okay.
not to get to our.
Okay,
PII
that's what I
data.
was concerned about.
Right. They can try to sell us things, but
Yeah,
they,
well, they try to sell me lots of
right,
things.
but they can't get to our data.
Okay, that's good. That makes me feel better. I'll sleep better tonight.
Okay, good.
Okay, Board
Thank
Member
you.
Rankin, you had some more stuff.
Yes, I would recommend that we put this award recognition proposal on, as a discussion item on a future agenda, and then we can bring it forward. Then I have one more item to bring forward, and that is our contractor breach policy. And this is something that that Board Member Goff and I, we received it, and then we talked about it and found out we have exactly the same concerns and questions that were not huge, but we got them answered. One main one was, what's the difference between a contractor, a subcontractor, and a vendor? And we found that in this contract, they're all the same. Just a minor cleanup there. And then also, Board Member Goff brought up, if this is our policy, which we need to have by statute, what are the school districts doing to keep their contractors' policies, or they have a second step if there's a breach? But this is the first step, and this is the step that we have to handle. And if we don't adopt...
So it's tomorrow. It's on the agenda for tomorrow.
Oh, it is
right?
good.
It's
Good.
on the
I was gonna
agenda for
say,
tomorrow.
If we don't, it's going to go to August, so I would recommend that everyone read it, and if you have any questions, bring them tomorrow, and hopefully we can get a vote. Just needs a majority.
Yeah, so I think the issue is that generally speaking, when something new is brought to us, we have the information in the first meeting, and then in a subsequent meeting, we vote on it. And it's my understanding that Board Members Rankin and Goff would like us to vote tomorrow.
And approve.
And approve.
Recommend.
In any case, to suspend my rule, I guess, that says we take 2 meetings and to move it to 1. So I hope you'll read it again tonight, and I'm fine with that considering how important this particular issue is. Is that clear?
Thank
Do-
you, yes. Thanks, you already
Thank you.
got us off.
Do we have anyone here to public comment?
Carol's checking right now.
Was there any other business, board business, guys? I understand.
You paid a lot for these
We have nobody signed up for public comment.
Bingo. The meeting is adjourned until tomorrow. Bang.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.